Today's podcast will feature two stories that reveal we may not be alone in this universe. The audio from both of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Face Peelers, and it's about all these very strange events that took place in Peru. And the second and final story you'll hear is called The Window. This particular case prompted a full-scale military investigation into a subject that can only be described as paranormal. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do. So if that's of interest to you, please figure out which book the follow button is currently reading, and when they're about halfway done with it, go ahead and spoil the ending. Okay, let's get into our first story called Face Peelers. At 6:30 p.m. on July 29th, 2023, a 15-year-old girl named Talia Davila Diaz stood right outside her back door of her house, staring out at the thick, dense, shadowy rainforest that was her backyard. Talia lived in a tiny, isolated village in Peru that was literally in the middle of the Amazon rainforest. So as she was looking out, she would have seen these huge tropical trees and heard the sound of howler monkeys and exotic birds and animals moving all about, and the air would have been really thick and humid. But she wasn't thinking about any of that. Instead, she was focused on this grapefruit tree that was only a few yards away from her house. She wanted to go get a grapefruit and bring it inside and make juice for her family. However, Talia was scared. And she was scared for two reasons. The first reason was this was the Amazon, an inherently dangerous place, especially at night. There were loads of predators out there, like snakes and jaguars. But the other reason she was scared was that she was worried there could actually be something worse out in the rainforest, worse than any predators she was used to. And that was because over the last couple of weeks, people in Talia's village had been claiming they were seeing these shadowy figures lurking in the tree line with these bright green eyes that would occasionally seem like they were hunting the people of the village. Like anytime they went out, it was like these figures were kind of lurking off in the distance, but nobody knew what they were. The rumor around the village was that these shadowy figures were actually pelikaras, which translates literally to face peelers. People in Talia's village believed that pelikaras were foreigners who would kidnap locals and cut their throats and peel the skin of their face off and then sell their body fat on the black market. And the locals were so freaked out that pelikaras could be around that they began performing nightly patrols to keep the villagers safe. So Talia, again, was very scared to even leave her house at this point, but she was also trying to be reasonable. She'd gone out and gotten a grapefruit many times in the past. This was not some new behavior, so she's looking out and she sees the grapefruit tree and she knows there's a nightly patrol out right now, and I only have to go a few yards and get the fruit and get right back in the house. Like, how big of a deal could this possibly be? And so after taking one more look around and not seeing anybody or hearing anything that was out of place, she took a breath and then rushed out to the tree. She grabbed a grapefruit, and as she was turning around, she froze because her worst nightmare had just been realized. Now, standing between her and her back door were these two hulking dark figures. And one of them was like so tall, it was practically the size of a tree. And they both had these piercing, glowing green eyes. And they were looking right at Talia. And Talia was so instantaneously petrified that all she could do was just stand there and stare back into their green eyes. And as she did, she began to notice that their faces were grotesquely elongated, almost like they had masks on. And then before Talia could do anything, the really tall one began sort of gliding towards her. Not stepping towards her, but literally almost hovering off the ground towards Talia. And then suddenly, Talia was being grabbed and thrown to the ground. And the instant Talia hit the ground, these two figures descended on her and pinned her there. And then one of them reached down and pressed their hand over her mouth and her nose, and she couldn't breathe. And then she sees the other one is holding what looked like a box cutter or a knife, and they put it right up to her neck. And suddenly it's like Talia understands these are pelikaras. They're gonna slit her throat. They're gonna kill her. And so she has this sudden burst of energy and she manages to push them off of her. And when she did, their hand came off her mouth and she screamed out for help. and she heard somewhere in the village voices yelling back to her, and then she heard footsteps, and she knew it was the night patrol coming to save her. And so at this point, the figures released Talia, and she scrambled to her feet and immediately ran towards her house right as the night patrol came bounding into her yard, and one of the men had a gun, and he raised it and began shooting in the direction of the figures. And Talia, she's totally panicked, and she turns around and she looks at her attackers. And she's expecting them to, be fleeing into the rainforest. But instead, these dark figures, they were like levitating in the sky, and they were looking down at Talia and the night patrol with their glowing green eyes as they literally began to levitate into the sky. And the whole time, the night patrol is firing repeatedly at these things, and they just drifted off into the night and disappeared. Talia ultimately would not suffer any physical injuries from this encounter, but mentally, she was a wreck. And frankly, so was the rest of the people in her village, especially those who were on the night patrol and with Talia witnessed these figures with green eyes flying away into the sky. I mean, the fear in this village following this encounter was through the roof. And in fact, ultimately, the Peruvian government would get involved after this encounter, and they would investigate to try to figure out, what happened to Talia. And they would ultimately conclude that there was an illegal mining operation happening somewhere in the rainforest, and some of these miners, in an effort to scare people away from coming anywhere near their operation, they got their hands on jetpacks, wore armor and masks, and then went into villages like Talia's and basically pretended to be aliens and then did, fly off on their jetpacks. That is the official story as of right now. However, people like Talia and the other people in her village and many other people who live in the Amazon rainforest who have come in contact with these figures with green eyes, they say those are no miners. Those are either Palacaras or they are creatures from another world. The next and final story of today's episode is called The Window. On March 4th, 1946, nearly every resident of a rural Brazilian town called Araçariguama packed up a few days' worth of food and drink and headed south to the nearest big city to celebrate the Festival of Carnaval. This festival is an opportunity for folks to cut loose and eat good food right before most of them go into a religious fasting period. One resident who opted not to join the fun at this festival was a 44-year-old man named João Prestige Filho. João was a farmer, he had 5 kids, he was a very quiet guy, and he did not enjoy things like the Festival for Carnaval. The crowds and the noise made him anxious, and he really hated dancing, which there was a lot of at these festivals. Instead, João would rather spend his spare time out in nature. And so, when João's friends and family and everybody else disappeared to head off to this festival, João did just that. He and his best friend packed up João's horse and cart, and they traveled across the dirt roads through the woods to the nearby Tietê River, where they spent the day fishing for catfish. And as João stood on the rocks casting out his line, he listened to the birds sing and the parrots swooping by. It was beautiful and sunny out. I mean, this was a perfect day for João. As sunset drew near, though, both João and his best friend knew that while the rainforest they were in was beautiful during the day, at night it could become quite hazardous with the animals that come out at night, and so they knew they needed to leave. And so they packed up all the fish they caught back into João's cart, and then the two of them hopped onto the cart and began making the journey back towards the town of Araçariguama. When the pair got to a split in the road, João's best friend hopped off the cart and walked on foot down one path because his house was actually just outside of the town, and João, still in his cart with his horse, said bye to his friend and went the other direction. Now, by this point, the sun had completely set, and so it was totally dark out as João is going down this dirt road in the final stretch towards his town. At this time, in 1946, Araçariguama was a beautiful place, but by no means a modern place. They had no running water, no electricity, there was no sewage, no paved roads, no access to main roads, and nobody had a telephone. It was basically like this little patch of civilization with about 100 people living there, There was a church in the middle of the town and a couple of small huts that kind of sat around it. And Joao and his family lived in one of those huts. Joao usually loved walking along or traveling along this particular stretch of dirt road, especially at night, like he was doing right now. He really enjoyed looking up at the stars and listening to the animals off in the forest that he couldn't see. But this night, Joao just had a bad feeling as he was making this final approach towards his town. Now remember, there's almost no one in the town. They're all at this festival, so it's kind of like a ghost town in the middle of a forest. But Joao, as he's going down this dirt road and he can see the church up ahead, he's a couple hundred feet away, he began getting this very unnerving sense that he was being watched. And so Joao, as he's in his cart, began looking into the trees and all around him, wondering if maybe an animal or a person was nearby, but there was no one. Finally, Joao actually reached the church and he could see his little house, and he could also see that his wife, who was at the festival, had opened up one of the windows just slightly so he could open it up the rest of the way and crawl into the house when he was back from fishing, because she had locked the doors when she left. And so by this point, Joao was trying to be very calm and collected despite the stress of feeling like he's being watched. But when he saw that window and he saw how close he was to his house, he basically just had the horse sprint the rest of the way to his home. He just wanted to get off the streets. And so finally, Joao, he reaches his house, he crawls in through the window, he shuts it behind him, and immediately Joao expected to feel totally relieved that he was now behind locked and closed doors and windows. He was safe. But despite being inside of his home, he still had this sense that there was someone or something around him that was watching him. Joao, like many other residents of this village, was fairly superstitious. There was an old abandoned mine that was near the town, and Joao and his peers had grown up hearing stories about some monster that lived in the mine that would come out at night and roam the forest. And older people in this village would talk about this ancient serpent called Boitata that would come out at night and it would appear in a burst of fire. And so Joao, he's thinking about the mine and these demons and ghosts that roam in the forest, and he's all alone because everyone's at this festival and he doesn't feel safe inside of his house, and so he's really starting to panic. And it's at this moment that he suddenly feels this sense that whatever or whoever has been watching him is right out his window to his left. And so Joao, as he's turning to look out the window, he's anticipating seeing a person out there, or maybe a jaguar or some other animal that's followed him from the rainforest. But when Joao turns and looks out the window into the dark night, what he sees right outside of his property was so terrifying that for a second Joao couldn't even breathe. And he just stood there staring at this thing, and then he tried to put his hands up to protect himself, but it was already too late. Minutes later, Joao would come stumbling out of his front door, out into the dark night. He's got a big blanket wrapped around him, and he was just screaming incoherently. And as he screamed all this nonsense, he began running in this kind of zigzag pattern with no clear destination in mind. It was just like this mindless running all through the village. And as he's running, he's got no shoes on, and he's stepping on sharp rocks and glass and trash. He's cutting his feet up horribly, but he doesn't seem to even notice. And so as he's doing this, he's causing this huge scene, but everybody's gone. It's a ghost town. It's just him in this abandoned village in the middle of a rainforest in Brazil. But eventually, Joao kind of calmed himself down and ran to his sister's house, Marie, because he noticed there was a lamp on inside of her house, and he was hoping that maybe she too had stayed back from the festival. And it would turn out Marie had not gone to the festival. She too did not really like big gatherings like that, and so she was home. And so Marie was in her kitchen when she began hearing outside this horrible screaming sound, almost guttural sounds coming from someone or some animal out there. And then before she could even figure out what it was, she heard this loud thud against her door. Marie was terrified, and she ran to her front window to look out and see what it was that had just collided with her door. And what she saw made no sense. It was her brother, Joao, but he was wrapped in that big blanket and his feet were all bloody, and he was screaming at the top of his lungs, but he wasn't saying anything. He was just kind of babbling. And so Marie was about to run over and open the door for her brother. But right before she did, as she's looking out the window, Joao turned and looked at her, and when he did, she screamed because his eyes looked so alien. They were wide and totally unfocused, and she thought, that can't be my brother. What's wrong with him? But she would go over and open the door because after all, it is her brother. And so she opens the door, Joao kind of falls into the room and began writhing around on the ground, continuing this scream he was emitting that didn't even seem human. And the whole time, Marie is trying to ask him, what's wrong? What's going on here? She's scanning him, and besides the cuts all over his feet, he didn't appear to have other injuries. And so eventually, Marie just knelt down and she was about to grab Joao and try to kind of stop him from moving around, to just look at him and try to have a conversation with him. But before she grabbed him, Joao rolled over and his lips opened up, exposing his teeth. And he kind of grimaced at her with those wild, unfocused eyes. And again, Marie just kind of backed up in horror. Who is this? What's happened to my brother? And as Marie stood up to get away from Joao, still with that sickening grin with his teeth exposed, had this kind of low hiss come out of his mouth. And so Marie, thinking he was trying to talk, she leaned in, and through this hiss, she heard him repeating, "It burns, it burns." And so Marie, thinking her brother must have been burned, instinctively began removing the blanket and pulling his clothes off to find the source of this burn on her brother. But besides the cuts all over his feet, as she's looking at his body, his skin looked totally normal. He looked completely unhurt. And so Marie turned up to look at Joao's face again to ask him more questions in hopes maybe he could tell her something. And it was at that moment she noticed that even though he didn't seem to have any other injuries, his complexion on his face was now starting to change. Now Joao's cheeks had turned this kind of dark purple and almost looked like they were starting to swell. And so at this point, Marie knew, okay, I can't handle this. I don't know what's going on here. And so she would stand up and just kind of back away from Joao, who's still got that grimace with his teeth exposed and his purple cheeks. He's staring up at Marie. And Marie, she finally backs out and she goes out the front door and she begins running to the other side of town. Marie knew that there were two other men who had stayed home from this festival. It was the town sheriff and the town doctor, whose name was Arasi Gumiji. And those two men lived close together on the other side of town. And when Marie arrived in front of their homes and began pounding on their doors and yelling for help, the two men quickly came outside, at which point Marie tried to explain what was happening to her brother, but she didn't really have the words, and so she just said, "He needs your help." And so the two men just went with Marie, and they ran back across town to Marie's house, where Joao was still on the ground, writhing in pain when they went inside. Marie had only been gone for a couple of minutes, but by now it wasn't just Joao's cheeks that had turned that purplish color. His chest and arms were also turning purple. At this point, the sheriff leaned over Joao and began asking him some questions, and Joao, he was obviously in horrible pain from something, but by this point he had calmed down enough to where he was speaking a little bit more, but what he was saying made no sense. He told the sheriff that he had been followed home and then he got burned. And when the sheriff asked him, "Who burned you?" all Joao could say was, "No one is to blame." At this point, the sheriff left Marie's house and jogged over to Joao's house to look for some sign of how he got burned. But when he got there, the house was completely unburned. Everything was exactly as it should have been. There was no scorch marks. There was not even a lit candle anywhere. So there was no clues as to what happened to Joao. By the time the sheriff got back to Marie's, it had been about 45 minutes from when Joao first got hurt, and now whatever was happening to his body that was turning him purple appeared to be getting much worse. Joao's skin all over his face and his chest and his arms was now not only a very dark purple, but his skin was starting to blister and pop. In fact, there was one area on his arm that had bubbled up so much that when it burst, you could actually see the bone in his arm. It was almost like Joao had been boiled in water, like the way you would boil meat on a bone until the meat was tender enough that it fell off the bone. It was like that was happening to Joao. And so as Joao's flesh just sort of began cooking off of him, the town doctor, Arasi, said, "We have to get him to a hospital right now." But because the roads were not paved and it was dangerous traveling at night, they knew they couldn't get him to the big city hospital. They would have to take him to a local hospital. And so the sheriff, who had a truck, said, "Let's just put him in the truck and I will drive him there." And so Arasi, the sheriff, and Marie, they got a new sheet, they wrapped up Joao inside of it, and they brought him outside, they put him in the sheriff's truck, and they began driving towards the hospital. Arasi stayed in the back with Joao as they made this drive, and every time the truck went over a bump, Joao would let out a cry of pain, and Arasi would look over and he would literally see these bumps were causing his skin to kind of fall off of his body. When they finally arrived at the local hospital, the staff there pulled Joao inside, they put him in a private room, they put him on a bed, and they had no idea how to treat him. It was like his injuries looked nothing like they had ever seen, they didn't even know where to begin, and they kind of assumed that Joao would not survive whatever was happening to him, and so the first thing they did is just pumped him full of painkillers. And while these painkillers didn't actually do anything to stop basically Joao's body from decomposing while he was still alive, they did at least allow Joao to stop feeling this horrible pain of his flesh falling off of him, and so Joao finally just kind of sunk back in his bed, and the sight of him must have just been horrific. He literally had huge chunks of his flesh just missing. I mean, literally parts of his skeleton were exposed to the naked eye. After the doctors had gotten Joao as stable as they could get him, Arasi, the local town doctor, sat down next to Joao and just began asking him questions. And for the first time, Joao was able to talk somewhat normally because he was on such a high dose of painkillers. And so Arasi began asking Joao to go over everything that happened from the time he left fishing for catfish until he arrived at his house and got burned. This is roughly what Joao told Arasi. He said on his walk home from fishing, he started getting that feeling that he was being watched, and it got more and more intense as he got into town until finally he basically sprinted the rest of the way to his house, practically dove through that open window, shut it behind him, and expected to feel relief being in his own home again. But he didn't. The feeling only intensified that he was being watched. And at some point, he got that sense that whoever or whatever was watching him was to his left out the window out into his yard. And when Joao turned to look, what he saw standing outside was this dark figure kind of hovering over the ground, and it was staring right at Joao. And before Joao could even put his hands up to protect himself from whatever or whoever this was, this figure shot this bright ray of light directly into Joao's home through that window, which hit Joao in the chest and the face. And immediately Joao was blinded and confused by this light, and then it really started to burn. He believed he was on fire, which is why he grabbed that blanket and wrapped it around himself. He was trying to put out a non-existent fire, and that's when he stumbled outside and kind of zigged and zagged, kind of half trying to put this fire out until he arrived at Marie's house. But when he got there, that sensation of feeling like he was on fire didn't go away. It just got worse and worse and worse, and then his skin began falling off. When Arasi asked Joao, who do you think did this to you? Who do you think that figure was? And Joao, with bulging eyes, would sit forward and say to Arasi, it wasn't of this world. And as Joao said this, a chunk from his cheek fell off, exposing his jaw and teeth. And as this happened, Joao asked one of the nurses for a water. And so Arasi is sitting there having heard the story as Joao, who's all hopped up on painkillers, is grabbing this water and drinking, and Arasi is watching the water dribble out of the hole now on the side of Joao's face. About 4 hours later, Joao would pass away from his injuries. There has never been any official explanation for what actually happened to Joao. The doctors just wrote cardiac arrest and generalized burns on his death certificate because they really had no idea what else to call this. Joao's family believed the Boitata, the ancient serpent that lived in the forest and appeared at night in a ball of fire, was responsible for what happened to Joao. Other people in town thought maybe it was the monsters or demons from the old abandoned mine that had come out and attacked Joao. Outside of Joao's town, people have theorized that Joao must have been subjected to some really high dose of radiation, and so this theory has led people to believe that, perhaps Joao was the victim of a secret weapon that the government was testing. But to create such a concentrated beam of radiation that only affects Joao would be way more technologically advanced than anything that was available at the time in the world. Not to mention, why would any government randomly target a Brazilian farmer with this weapon? But Joao would not be the only person in Brazil to die from mysterious rays of light. In the 1970s, so 30 years after Joao's death, several people in a city in northern Brazil reported seeing bright lights coming down from the sky, and then they too began turning purple and their skin began falling off and they would die. And so because of this high number of very strange deaths that looked just like Joao's, a new theory has taken root over the years to explain what happened to Joao and these people. And that is, they were attacked by a UFO. That Joao, when he looked out the window and saw that dark figure hovering over the ground, that was a UFO, and the light he saw was a weapon. The UFO was firing a ray of radiation that struck him and killed him like it struck and killed the others in Brazil. The military actually looked into this theory in 1977 and 1978. It was called Operation Saucer, like flying saucer. However, officially, they came out and said they found no evidence that UFOs were in any way involved in what happened to Joao or these other people. However, many people are skeptical that we're really getting the truth. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events. But we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen Podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio. Additional audio editing by Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. There's this one, the MrBallen Podcast, as well as MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, Redacted, Late Nights with Nexpo, and A Twist of History. All you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like this one, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's podcast will feature 3 stories that reveal we may not be alone in this universe. The audio from all 3 of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called The Wow Signal, and it's about the very best evidence of potential alien communication we've ever obtained. The second story you'll hear is called Better Than Earth, and it's about the 2020 discovery of 24 super habitable planets. And the third and final story you'll hear is called Don't Sleep, and it's about one of the most famous, potentially paranormal events of all time. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please put the Amazon Music follow button stapler in Jello. Okay, let's get into our first story called The Wow Signal. Late one night in the summer of 1977, a large radio telescope in Ohio intercepted a very unique signal. The telescope was searching the sky on behalf of an organization called SETI, which is the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, and the signal, although it only lasted 72 seconds, fit the profile of a message beamed to us from another world. Jerry Amon, who was a project scientist for SETI, was flipping through some of the computer printouts generated by the telescope when he noticed a series of letters. Now, the way this particular radio telescope worked is it pretty much constantly picked up a signal, but that signal was a very low background hum of static, and that was represented in 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All those low numbers are representative of that basic background sound that they just write off. It doesn't matter. Occasionally, the telescope would pick up a higher number on the readout, like a 7, an 8, a 9, and even above that, it transitions to letters to represent louder radio signals. But all of those higher signals had a rational explanation. Either they were anomalous, or they were tied to something very natural and ordinary. But that particular night in 1977, as the telescope swept across the sky, it picked up a signal that was so strong it surged past 0 through 9 and made its way into the letters all the way up to letter U, and it held it for 72 seconds, representing a signal that was 30 times stronger than what this telescope normally picks up as its baseline. And after those 72 seconds, the telescope eventually passed it, and that signal dropped all the way back down. So when Amon saw this amazing string of letters representing this radio signal, he circled it in red ink and wrote next to it, "Wow!" exclamation point, and from that point forward, this transmission became the WOW signal. One of the main reasons the WOW signal was not immediately cast out as some anomaly or chalked up to some other natural occurrence is because of what we understand about radio wave transmission. The goal of this radio telescope was to try to pick up radio signals coming in from other worlds. And so the way they did that is they opened up a whole bunch of different channels, receivers, they had 50 of them, and anytime they were aiming their dish in a direction of the sky, if there was any radio waves coming towards them, they tried to capture them on different radio frequencies. If you were aiming your antenna in a direction where natural radio waves were coming towards you, it would hit one channel and then diffuse over adjacent channels because it's not a targeted radio wave. It's natural. It's more like a shotgun blast. Non-natural radio waves, like the ones we're familiar with when we listen to the radio, listen to music, those are targeted radio waves, meaning when they were sent out in a very narrow band. They were sent out on a single frequency. And only people that have turned to that particular frequency or that particular receiver are going to hear your message. That is a non-natural radio wave. The night that the WOW signal was picked up, it was only picked up on one channel. It did not diffuse over the others, meaning the WOW signal is not natural and was created by someone or something. And for the SETI researchers that are literally combing the sky for signs of extraterrestrial life, this is exactly what they were looking for. It is what an intelligent life form would do to try to communicate. They would use one radio frequency to demonstrate this is intentional. But despite decades of professional and amateur astronomers searching the sky for this WOW signal, it's never been found again. While there's many theories about what could have caused the WOW signal, obviously ranging from extraterrestrial life to a comet that passed by in 1977 that we only recently knew about, to a secret spy satellite, the bottom line is, to this day, we cannot adequately explain it. It remains the best evidence of alien communication ever obtained. Our next story is called Better Than Earth. Just 30 years ago, we had not discovered a single planet outside of our solar system. Today, we've discovered over 4,500 of them, and of all those planets we're discovering, 1 in 5 of them, scientists now say, are most likely habitable. There's really 2 criteria for a planet to be considered habitable. 1, it needs to be rocky, and 2, it needs to fall into the Goldilocks zone, where it's in its star's orbit in a place where it's neither too hot or too cold, allowing water to be in liquid form. One of the best chances we have so far at finding life on another one of these habitable planets is a planet called Ross 128b. It orbits an inactive red dwarf star, meaning it's likely not being bludgeoned by solar radiation, and we've detected strange signals emanating from the nearby host star, signals that perhaps have intelligent origins. Another habitable planet is Proxima b. It also happens to be the closest habitable planet to Earth, and is a lot like Ross 128b. However, the red dwarf it revolves around is much more temperamental and periodically casts out massive amounts of radiation that does make life quite difficult. It's also tidally locked and in synchronous rotation with its star, meaning one side of the planet is always facing the star and getting completely torched all the time. The other side, the dark side of the planet, never faces the star, and so everything is frozen. And so the only place liquid water could exist on Proxima b would be at the equator. Another area of the universe that scientists are focused on to try to see if there's life there right now, or could be life, is an area called the TRAPPIST-1 system. It's actually 7 different planets, all of which are considered habitable, that are orbiting around this one particular red dwarf. The really cool thing about this particular system is that the 7 planets are super close together. So close that if you were standing on one, you could look up and see all of the others, and you're so close you could actually make out geologic formations like mountains, and you could see clouds, and in theory, you could actually travel between the different planets. So imagine going on vacation to another planet. But to really get you thinking, a new study just released its results in October 2020. They looked at all 4,500 plus planets that are outside the solar system, and they ranked them according to how likely they are to sustain life. Not whether they're currently sustaining life, but looking at their conditions of how good of a planet are they to sustain life. And out of the 4,500, there were 24 at the top of the list that not only can sustain life, but actually can sustain life better than Earth can. They are considered super habitable, and they are literally better places to live than Earth is, which is definitely a foreign concept for most people because they think of Earth as like this oasis in this vast universe where everything lined up perfectly to sustain human life. And already, just out of the 4,500 planets that were reviewed that have only been discovered in the past 30 years, right? There's lots more planets out there. We've already found 24 that are better than Earth at sustaining life. So what happens when we discover there are millions, if not billions of planets out there? Just probability alone says there's going to be a heck of a lot more planets out there that are better at sustaining life than Earth. Which really forces you to come to terms with the reality that almost certainly we are not alone.
The next and final story of today's episode is called Don't Sleep.
Late on the evening of July 27th, 1977, a 21-year-old farmer named Huang Yan-cho walked down a wide, dusty road in the little farming village of Beigao, located in northern China. It had been a very hard day on the rice farm where Huang worked because they were all preparing for the autumn harvest. But even though Huang was totally exhausted and worn down, as he walked down this road, he was whistling an upbeat tune. Because for the first time in a long time, Huang was actually excited about the future. Huang had grown up in a poor family, and he hadn't even finished elementary school. He still lived with his parents in a tiny house, and basically every day of his life was the same. He got up at sunrise, he walked to work, he worked all day until he barely could even stand, and then he would walk home and he would go to bed. But the reason Huang was now feeling kind of excited about his future was because he had just gotten engaged to a beautiful girl in a neighboring village, and their plan was to get married after the autumn harvest. Huang was already hard at work, literally building them a house that they could move into after they got married. And in fact, on this particular night, that was where Huang was going. He was going to the property where he was in the middle of building this house, And he was going there not to work on the house anymore, but really just to admire his property, because again, he was just so excited about the future. Huang turned the corner and his beautiful half-constructed home came into focus. The foundation, the walls, and the ceiling were all complete. All he had left to do was put in the windows and the doors. And so Huang walked up and ran his hand over the beautiful brick he had laid around the outside of the property. Brick was not cheap. He had worked extra hours to afford this brick. And so he was just so proud of it. He ran his hand over it. And then he kind of stepped back and kind of imagined the house when it was all done. And then when he felt satisfied that he had seen enough, just kind of nodded and turned and just continued walking back towards his home, his parents' home, which was only a few minutes away. When Huang got to his home, he went inside and his mom already had a meal made for him. It was just some rice and veggies. And so Huang sat down and began eating, and then his parents came over and they began chatting. And then, of course, the conversation shifted to Huang's upcoming marriage, because that's basically all Huang ever wanted to talk about. And then by about 10 p.m., Huang was so tired that he crawled into his bed and he fell asleep almost immediately. The next morning, when Huang's parents woke up, they discovered that Huang was not in his bed. Now, this was not totally unusual because they knew their son was a really hard worker, and it wasn't unusual for him to wake up really, really early to head out to the farm to begin his workday. But a little while later, the workers at the rice farm where Huang worked, they saw Huang had not come to work. And because that was so out of character for him, one of the workers actually walked to Huang's parents' home to see if he was okay. And when Huang's mother found out her son had not shown up to work, she was really worried, but she told this worker, my son must have gone to the house he's building, go over there and see if he's there. But the worker from the rice farm went to Huang's property he was building and nobody was there. And so when he came back and told Huang's mother, this sent her into a total panic. Because really for her, this was like completely out of character for her son. He would never miss work. He would never just disappear like this. Something was wrong. So Huang's mother sent this rice farm worker to go find her husband and tell him what was going on with Huang. And then in the meantime, Huang's mother just walked outside and began going door to door, asking neighbors if they knew where her son was and if they wouldn't mind coming out and helping her look. Now, at this time, the village of Beigao was a relatively small place where all the residents more or less knew each other. And so it did not take long for the news of Huang being missing to spread all across Beigao, and the community really came out in force to go look for him. And so by the afternoon, you had villagers all over the place, literally biking all around town, calling out for Huang. People had gone to neighboring villages to see if he was there. Some other people went to Huang's fiance's home and spoke directly to the fiance, but she had no idea where Huang had gone. And so by about the early afternoon, when so many people couldn't find any leads to where Huang had gone, it became clear that really nobody had a clue what happened to him. Now, Beigao at the time was incredibly isolated. This is a small town where most of the people who live there don't have phones, they don't have cars, they ride their bikes everywhere, and there were no roads that connected Beigao to any other place. Now, there was a paved road that went through Beigao, but it actually just came to an end on the outskirts of Beigao. So there was just no way to go to other places, at least not efficiently. Basically, if you lived in Beigao at the time, there was a finite number of places you could go. And all these people that had gone out looking for Huang had searched all of those places, and Huang just was not there. And they discovered his bike was still leaning up against his parents' house, and his work clothes, which he wore basically every single day, were still folded up neatly inside of his room. And so wherever Huang was, he was on foot, and he was still in his pajamas. That night, Huang's parents would contact the village committee, which was basically like the governing body for Beigao. And the village committee decided that this was serious enough, because again, they're thinking, this is impossible, where is this guy? That they decided to contact the police. But when the police got this call, they did not launch an investigation right away because they had limited resources and there was no sign of foul play here. It was very weird that Huang was missing, but he was an adult, and if he wanted to go vanish somewhere, it was kind of like, okay, you're an adult, you can do that. And so Huang's family and the rest of the Beigao villagers were forced to just kind of wait and see if Huang came back.
But over the next few days, Huang did not come back, and there was still no new information about what might have happened to him. Early on the morning of August 5th, so 8 days after Huang went missing, and still by this point there's no sign of him, the deputy director of the Beigao Village Committee came running up the road to Huang's parents' house and knocked on the door. When the door opened up, it was Huang's father, and the deputy director handed him a telegram he had just gotten and said, "Read it." And so Huang's father took the telegram and began reading it, and as he did, his eyes went wide, and then when he was done, he looked up and he was just so confused. The telegram had been sent 8 days earlier at around 9 a.m. on July 28th, so basically right around the time that Huang's family discovered Huang was missing was when this telegram was sent. But for whatever reason, the telegram had been very delayed, and so they were just receiving this telegram now, 8 days later. And the contents of this telegram made no sense. It said that just 9 hours after Huang had fallen asleep in his parents' home, he was discovered lying on the sidewalk in the middle of this bustling city called Nanjing, located 600 miles to the north of Beigao. Now, the reason Huang's father and the deputy director were so confused by this telegram was this was impossible. Remember, Huang does not have a car, so the only way he could get around was on foot or on his bike, and we know he left his bike by his house. So he's on foot and very likely in his pajamas. And what? He's going to go 600 miles to the north? I mean, even if he walked the 30 miles to the nearest train station, 9 hours, because that's how much time it took from falling asleep to being discovered in the city, is not enough time to go the remaining 570 miles to Nanjing. So Huang's father and the deputy director, they talked about this, and they both decided that, this just can't be true. Clearly, somebody has mistaken some other person for Huang, because he cannot possibly be all the way in Nanjing. Now, this telegram said that Huang was being held in a deportation center in Shanghai, and so Huang's father and the deputy director decided they would send a telegram back to the sender at this deportation center and tell them, hey, if this really is Huang, he should have a very specific birthmark on his wrist. And so when they sent this telegram off, they fully expected to get one back that said, oh, our mistake, it wasn't him. But they got a reply relatively quickly, and it said, oh yeah, he's got that exact birthmark. It's definitely Huang, but he's very confused. He doesn't really know what's going on. And so somebody from your village has to go get him. Huang arrived back home in the middle of August, so about 2 weeks after he had gone missing. And as soon as he got there, his fiance and his parents were so happy to see him, and pretty soon a steady stream of friends and neighbors and other family members began coming to Huang's house to talk to him, to hear his story, to hear about what happened. I mean, this is a tiny, isolated place in the middle of rural China. Not a lot of exciting things happen out here, and so people were really excited to hear what Huang had to say. But Huang really didn't understand what had happened to him, and so mostly he just didn't answer any questions he got asked. He just kind of kept his head down and just kept saying, I don't know what happened. And then really when his family pressed him and said, you gotta tell us, this is so crazy, what happened? He would say, look, I'm gonna tell you what happened, but I don't even know if I can believe the things I'm gonna tell you. And so Huang would say, all he could remember was he went to bed in his own bed in Beigao. And then the next morning he woke up and he was laying on the sidewalk. And when he opened his eyes, he saw there was this big swimming pool, and then near it was a sign that said Nanjing. And so that was how he put together that he was in Nanjing. And then almost immediately, these two police officers wearing all white just kind of appeared out of nowhere, and they walked up to Huang, they scooped him up, and without really saying anything to him, they brought him to that deportation center in Shanghai, which is a place where people who seem confused or mentally ill would be sent in order to help them get home. And that was it. That was Huang's entire story, that he just basically woke up in Nanjing with no idea how he got there. And so after he told his family, they all just kind of looked at him like, really? That's what happened? That makes no sense. But Huang, he was completely lucid. He was explaining it really specifically and really simply. He looked and sounded exactly like he normally did, and he seemed very honest as he was telling the story. Over the next few weeks, Huang kind of reintegrated back into his life, but things just were not the same. People were now scared of him. I mean, kids literally ran away from him when they saw him because rumors were going around town that he himself, his body, was haunted or something. And so kids were scared of him, and other villagers would openly gossip about him right in front of him. I mean, even his beloved fiancée admitted to feeling really uncomfortable around him now. And while all of this was obviously very upsetting for Huang, he did also understand why people were acting this way. I mean, this is a very anomalous thing that's happened to him, and he did not have a good explanation for this totally insane event that he was a part of. And so he just kind of got it. And in fact, Huang himself was kind of terrified of himself. I mean, at night when he would go to bed, he would be terrified that the second he closed his eyes, he was going to be transported hundreds or thousands of miles away to some totally unknown place, and maybe this time he wouldn't even be able to get back again. But as the days wore on, Huang continued to wake up in his own bed in Beigao, which over time kind of made him feel more secure that whatever happened to him was a one-time thing and it's not going to happen again. However, Huang would be wrong. On September 8th, 1977, so 3 weeks after Huang had returned back home, he went to sleep in his bed in the village of Beigao, but when he woke up the next morning, he was not there. The first thing Huang noticed when he woke up that morning were the sounds around him were totally different. They were not right. Normally, when he was asleep in his home, he would hear the sound of his mother and father snoring right by him, and he might hear some insects or birds out his window. And those sounds were gone. Instead, he heard what sounded like footsteps, but not ordinary footsteps. They were footsteps of somebody walking on cement who was wearing high heels, like a clicking sound. And then Huang also became aware of the fact that his face was clearly pressed up against cement. He was laying on the ground. But Huang couldn't open his eyes. As hard as he tried, he couldn't do it. He couldn't move his body. And so he's just laying there on cement with his eyes closed, listening to the sound of these footsteps, these high heels, getting closer and closer and closer. And as they did, his anxiety was growing and growing. He had no idea who this person was. And then these footsteps, they got right up to him and then passed by him. And Huang felt the breeze as this person walked right past him. And then after this person in high heels had kind of walked off in the other direction, Huang finally was able to wrench open his eyes and he sat up. And he looked around, and one, he couldn't find anybody. It was totally abandoned all around him. So whoever had those high heels on had somehow vanished in plain sight. And then also, as Huang continued to look around him, it looked like he was in the middle of this city. But again, there's nobody out there. It's like this abandoned city street. All he had in front of him was this clock up on a building that said 1 a.m. And so pretty soon, Huang was just kind of walking in circles, screaming out for help. And right when he was about to just start sprinting in any one direction in hope that help would be somewhere out there, Huang felt a tap on his shoulder. And then the person tapping him from behind him said, "Are you Huang Yanzhou?" Huang spun around and he saw there were these two men in military uniforms standing there. And for a second, Huang felt relieved. Somebody was here to help him. But then he thought to himself, how do they know my name? What's going on here? And so he asked them, how do you know my name? But the two men didn't answer Huang. Instead, they told him that he was at a Shanghai railway station 700 miles from Beigao, and that they, these two soldiers, were here to take Huang to a nearby army base. At this point, Huang was so scared, he just didn't know what to do. So he just wound up going with these two soldiers who put him in the back of a Jeep. And then they hopped in and began driving, and they drove him out of this weird abandoned city where he had woken up. And after driving for some time, they arrived at this huge army base that had all these rows of fencing around it with razor wire on top and all these sentries that guarded all the doors. And these two soldiers brought him through several of these checkpoints. And then when they reached the very last one, they stopped the car, they got out, Huang got out too, and the two soldiers that were with him grabbed Huang's shoulders, and they basically led him through the last checkpoint, which was manned by armed guards. And as Huang was led through this gate, the armed guards seemed to not even notice the soldiers or Huang. It was like they were invisible to the armed guards. But either way, they got through the final checkpoint, and then the two soldiers that were carrying Huang led him to this kind of nondescript big building, and they opened up a door, and they began walking down this long hallway that kind of zigged and zagged. It was like a maze of different directions you could go. And then finally, they brought Huang right to this big door that said division headquarters over it. And then before Huang could say anything, one of the two soldiers that was with him knocked on the door. And then before anybody could respond, that same soldier reached down, opened it up, swung the door in, and then they pushed Huang inside, and they stepped in after him and shut the door behind them. In front of Huang was this big desk, and sitting behind this desk was a very senior-looking military official wearing a uniform. And this official, when they looked up and saw Huang standing there, they got up to their feet and put their hands on their gun and said, "What are you doing here? How'd you get in here?" And Huang, sensing there was something wrong, threw his hands up to show he was not a threat and pointed behind him and said, "They brought me here." And the military official, who still had his hand on his gun, looked behind Huang and said, "Who brought you here?" And Huang, he turned around and he saw the two soldiers who had picked him up and driven him here and led him to this room. They were gone. Which was impossible because Huang would have heard them leave. He didn't hear anything. The door never opened. They just somehow were gone. A second later, the senior military official had pulled out his radio and he was screaming commands. And then another second later, armed soldiers came running into the room. They grabbed Huang, who still had his hands up. They came in, they arrested Huang, and they began asking him all these questions about how he got in here. How did you get through the guards? Did you climb the fence? Did you cut the fence? How did you get in here? It's not possible that you are here right now. But Huang did not have any answers. All he could say was, "The two soldiers, they brought me here." A couple of days later, Huang would be bussed back to Beigao, and again, his friends and family and everybody in town had all these questions about what happened, but again, Huang just had no answers. And then just 11 days after coming back home the second time, Huang would disappear again. And this time, he would tell people he encountered two men who told him they were the same two men from the other two times he had gone missing. You had the first instance where he woke up and two police officers in white picked him up off the ground and brought him to the deportation center. And then the second time was the military base where you had those two soldiers who brought him through the gates and brought him to division headquarters. Basically, these two men he encountered on the third trip were saying they were the same men across all three instances. And on this third instance that he went missing, Huang said these two men put him on their backs and they flew him to 9 different cities around China for reasons unknown, and then they flew him back to Beigao and just dropped him off right outside his house near a tree, and that was it. Now, of course, this final disappearance sounds the most absurd because what, he was flying on the backs of people to all these different cities? That doesn't make any sense. But when Huang was kind of aggressively questioned about this third story, because it sounded the most made up as compared to the other two, it would turn out Huang had all this kind of insider information about each of the 9 cities that he supposedly was flown to by these two men. He knew the weather in each of those cities on the night that he was gone. He knew what shows were playing on the night he was gone. And he also just had really specific descriptions of where he was in each of these cities when they got there that all checked out. Now, you gotta remember that getting that information correct would have been really hard for Huang at the time. He did not have internet access. He didn't have a phone. He didn't have a car. I mean, he lives in an isolated small village in rural China. So the idea that literally the morning after all this happens, he's flown to these different cities, that he would have all this information perfectly correct, that's hard to do. That would be hard to lie about. As of today, no one has ever been able to debunk Huang's stories. Basically, there's enough legitimacy and verifiable information in his stories that you really can't discount them. They really could have happened. Add in the fact that Huang actually took a lie detector test and passed it, and suddenly you're looking at a story that, as crazy as it sounds, really could have happened. And so Huang's story today is considered far and away the most famous UFO story in China's history. Because the leading theory here is that Huang must have been abducted by aliens, and that's how he was being moved around to all these places, and maybe those two men that kept showing up in each of these events were the extraterrestrials that had scooped him up. Nobody knows, but that is the theory. As for Huang, he wishes none of this had ever happened because his disappearances and whatever happened to him basically wrecked his life. His fiancée broke up with him because she was so uncomfortable around him, and there was a lot of stigma around Huang, especially in the village where everybody thought he was a liar. And then on top of that, all these news and film and TV crews came to the village because they wanted to shoot shows and documentaries about Huang, and Huang did not want anything to do with them. But again, like, all these people are coming to the village for Huang, and it's making the rest of the villagers upset. And then also there was a really lengthy investigation by the police and by the military to try to figure out how in the world Huang got into that army base. I mean, there were layers and layers of security that he somehow got through, and all those armed guards that were watching the gates said they never saw Huang walk through, even though Huang said he literally just walked through the gate with the two soldiers that were carrying him through. And so today, Huang actually still lives in Beigao, and he had a son and a daughter, and he has grandkids, but he refuses to talk about what happened to him because, again, it wrecked his life.
A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. There's this one, of course, the MrBallen Podcast, and there's MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, Redacted, and Late Nights with Nexpo. All you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like this one, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's podcast will feature two stories that show we may not be alone in this universe. The audio from both of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Exposed, and it's about a horrifying discovery in Brazil that was hidden by their government, but when photos were eventually leaked, it sent people into a panic. The second and final story you'll hear is called Jelly, and it's about this very strange occurrence over in England that is often cited as one of the most credible paranormal events in history. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please invite the Amazon Music follow button to come on out for a night of fun with you out on the town, but don't show up and don't answer any of their phone calls or text messages all night. Okay, let's get into our first story called Exposed.
On the afternoon of September 29th, 1988, a 10-year-old boy named Francisco was walking along the perimeter of a man-made lake in southern Brazil while poking the ground with his stick. Francisco was doing one of his favorite after-school activities, which was looking for bugs. And this lake, which was a part of the Billings Reservoir in the Brazilian state of Sao Paulo, was his favorite place to do that. And the reservoir was gigantic, but it was not shaped like a typical circular lake. Instead, it was more like a big river that kind of wound around and had all these skinny branches kind of jutting off the sides of it. And on this particular day, Francisco was walking along one of those skinny offshoots of this lake, where at certain points, if Francisco wanted to, he could literally swim to the other side of the lake in a matter of minutes. Now, Francisco knew he was not really supposed to be anywhere near this reservoir. because in recent years, gangs from the nearby cities would bring their murder victims out to this reservoir and bury them here. And so locals knew it was not a safe place and to stay clear. But Francisco, he didn't listen to any of that because he loved walking around this lake and looking for bugs. And so he thought, you know what? No one's harmed me yet, so what's the big deal? And so, as Francisco casually walked along, poking at the mud, looking for his bugs, he finally saw one. It was a huge water scorpion, almost 2 inches long, and so immediately Francisco, without taking his eyes off the bug, drops his backpack, grabs a clear container that he kept in the side pocket, he opened it up, he bent down, and he scooped up this water scorpion and capped it, and then he brought the container up and looked inside to kind of admire his new pet. And as he was staring at this container, he noticed something odd on the other side of the lake. He basically saw it through the plastic container. And so he lowered the container to get a better look at this strange thing on the other side of the water. And what he saw was this big group of vultures, all kind of standing in a circle right on the water's edge. And immediately, Francisco was way more interested in these vultures than in his bug, because vultures meant there had to be a dead thing nearby, because vultures are scavengers. And so whatever they were circled around was probably a dead animal. But Francisco, he looked around and realized there was no way to get to the other side of the water to see whatever this dead thing was unless he swam. And he knew if he went back home with soaking wet clothes, his mom would know he had snuck to the reservoir and he'd be in lots of trouble. And so, feeling really frustrated, Francisco just picked up a rock and chucked it to the other side, trying to splash the water near the vultures to get them to fly away so he could see the dead thing. But the first rock he threw did not really have an effect. The vultures just kind of turned around and looked at him and then went back to whatever was on the ground. And so Francisco gathered a big pile of like 25 rocks and began throwing them one after the other at these vultures. And finally, Francisco had caused enough chaos on the other side of the water that the vultures got upset and they took to the air and they flew away. And finally, Francisco got a clear view of the dead thing that was in the middle of the circle of vultures. Now, initially, Francisco thought this dead thing was going to be maybe a bird or some other small animal from the area, but when he got a good look at this dead thing from 30 feet away, it didn't look like either of those things. It didn't have fur, it didn't have feathers, it actually looked kind of pale, almost like a pig. But Francisco's thinking to himself, why would a pig be all the way out here? And then it slowly dawned on Francisco that what he was looking at was actually a dead person. Suddenly terrified, Francisco scooped up his things, turned around, and ran to the nearest village where he began screaming for help. Within a few hours, the area along the water where the vultures had been and where this body was swarming with police and also with curious villagers. Normally, when a body was discovered in or near this reservoir, which unfortunately happened quite a bit because of all the recent gang violence, police would often break ranks from the investigation and walk over to the local onlookers and kind of fill them in and tell them, who this person was and what they think happened. But this time it was totally different. The police were totally secretive and it was really obvious. The police immediately roped off the entire area with crime scene tape, and then the police officers stood in a circle, shoulder to shoulder, blocking the view of the villagers so they couldn't see the body. And then when villagers actually walked up to police and said, hey, can you tell us what's going on? The police would say they couldn't talk about it, and then they would tell the villagers to back up and stay away. Locals would stick around for a while, being treated this way the entire time by police, and then finally when the sun started to go down and it was clear the police were very committed to hiding what was going on, whoever was still there finally just left, figuring when they got home they could just turn on the news and see what had happened with this dead person. But when they got home and turned on their TV, there was not one news story about this body. And at a minimum, this story should have dominated local news, but it somehow was not being talked about. And then even stranger was the next morning when locals got up, they headed back to the reservoir to see what the police were up to. And when they got there, they found the police were gone, the body was gone, and there was absolutely no trace that anyone or anything had ever been there. It was like it had been totally sanitized. For days, locals in this area continued to check the TV news, they checked the radio, the newspapers for some story, some bit of information about this dead body that was found. But again, there was just absolutely nothing, and it just made no sense. Why wasn't anyone talking about this? And so eventually, in the absence of any official information about what happened, a rumor began to circulate among locals that the body belonged to a local fisherman who had gone missing 3 days before Francisco discovered him. And this fisherman, apparently he was an alcoholic, and he had gone to the reservoir and he had begun drinking, and apparently he drank so much that it killed him. Now, many people wondered, if this drunk fisherman story was the real story, then why were the police so secretive about the body, and why weren't they willing to give up any information to the crowd about what had happened to this guy? I mean, a drunk fisherman is not a super sensitive thing. It just seemed like that doesn't line up with the police's behavior. But questions like these remained unanswered, and after several weeks of still no new information, no news coverage anywhere, even the most skeptical of villagers who really thought there's something weird going on here, they just kind of forgot about it and moved on. Until 6 years later, in 1994, when someone, we don't know who, from the Brazilian government decided they just couldn't keep the secret any longer. And so they gathered up some photos and an autopsy report they were not supposed to have, and they smuggled those things to the media. And once the media published these things, it became immediately clear that the dead man who was found in the reservoir in 1988 was not a drunk fisherman who drank himself to death, nor was he the victim of gang violence. Instead, it appeared that this person's death could potentially be paranormal. But before we dive into the significance of those leaked photos and the leaked autopsy report, you need to understand a weird aspect of Brazil's history. Brazil has an absolutely astounding number of sightings of unidentified flying objects, or UFOs for short. And these are not your typical UFO stories where some person claims they saw aliens or they were abducted by aliens, but they have no witnesses, they have no proof, they have nothing but their own story. No, in Brazil, the bulk of their UFO sightings are reported by their military, because Brazil actually has a government program to monitor UFO sightings because it happens so much in their country. In fact, the Brazilian government was directly involved in one of the most famous UFO sightings of all time. It was called the Night of the UFOs. This famous sighting, or sightings, because it actually happened in 4 different Brazilian states simultaneously, happened on May 19th, 1986, which was 2 years before Francisco spotted the dead body in the reservoir. On that 1986 day, at around 8:15 p.m., an air traffic controller at an international airport in Sao Paulo noticed 3 red lights hovering over the airport, and so the controller called it in and asked, what are these things? But nobody knew. And at the exact same time, all across Brazil, dozens and dozens of other people who have no idea what's happening at this international airport began reporting that they too were seeing strange lights in the sky. And many of these reports of these lights were coming from military personnel and government officials. And so this was like a really big deal that all across Brazil, everybody's seeing lights in the sky. And so the government, in response to this, scrambled their fighter jets and sent the jets up to try to intercept one of these sets of lights, just to see who or what they were and potentially shoot them down if they had to. But when these jets got anywhere close to these unidentified flying objects, these lights in the sky, these UFOs would move away instantly. One UFO was observed suddenly disappearing and then reappearing 20 miles away in just 5 seconds, which meant that UFO had to travel at least 5 times the speed of sound to cover that distance in such a short amount of time. For reference, humans are not capable of going that fast. We cannot do that. Eventually, the night of the UFOs ended when all these UFOs, these lights in the sky, just kind of suddenly vanished. And then a couple of days later, the Brazilian government held this big press conference about the event, and they would say, we have no idea what those lights were or where they came from. We have no clue. However, whoever or whatever was controlling these UFOs showed obvious signs of intelligence. Now, as mind-blowing as that would be to hear that potentially intelligent creatures are flying around your airspace, remember, this is Brazil, where UFO sightings were kind of the norm, And so people were definitely shocked by this. This was a terrifying thing, but they just kind of accepted what they were told and assumed, the government will handle this, and people moved on with their lives. That is, until several years later in 1994, when those photos and the autopsy report of the dead person in the reservoir were leaked, and then suddenly the people of Brazil, they're seeing this stuff and they're realizing, wait a minute, the night of the UFOs may not have been an isolated instance. Those UFOs may never have left. Here is what the public learned from the leaked photos and the leaked autopsy report. Back in 1988, when little Francisco spotted the dead body from the other side of the water, he correctly identified that it was a man's body. But Francisco had been wrong when he told authorities that it didn't look like this guy had any visible injuries on him. And the guy was naked, and so Francisco felt pretty confident that he would have seen something if the guy was wounded. But when the police arrived and they saw the body up close, they immediately saw he had several very serious and very strange physical injuries. He had these 4 perfectly circular 1 to 1.5 inch diameter holes drilled into his body. There were 2 right above his chest, basically sitting above his armpit. There was one that was right over his belly button, so his belly button was gone. It was just a hole where it had been. And there was also one in his crotch. And these holes were not crudely done. These were done with surgical precision, almost like whoever had done it was using high-end medical tools to make these cuts. Now, at first glance, the authorities had no idea why these holes were on this guy's body. But when the autopsy was done, they discovered this man was missing the majority of his internal organs, and after doing some investigating, they discovered that all of his organs had literally been vacuumed out of him through these holes on his body. Those holes were basically just ports to pull things out of him. Also, most of the man's blood had been suctioned out of those holes as well. But that wasn't all. The man also had one of his ears removed, one of his eyes was removed, and the lower part of his face was also removed. And again, all of these cuts looked like they had been made with absolute surgical precision. But perhaps the most brutal aspect of all the things that came to light when these documents were leaked was something that, unless you looked really closely at the autopsy report, you wouldn't necessarily notice. And it had to do with this man's vagus nerve. Your vagus nerve is something that controls part of your nervous system that's responsible for automatic functions like heart rate and digestion. And so when your body is suddenly in great distress, like suddenly you're fighting for your life or something, your vagus nerve can basically shut off those automatic functions like digestion in order to ensure all your energy is going towards fighting for your life. But in this dead man's case, his autopsy revealed that his vagus nerve had gone absolutely wild right at the moment of his death. It's complicated, but this suggests that this man was very likely alive when his face was being surgically cut off, and those holes were being drilled into his body, and his organs were being vacuumed out. And then at some point, the excruciating pain that came from these horrible things happening to him got so bad, his vagus nerve basically turned off his heart. So it was not these horrible physical injuries that killed him. He literally died from the pain of these physical injuries. In short, his body basically killed itself to avoid feeling the pain it was feeling. So, I'm sure you're wondering, how does the dead man in the reservoir and these leaked photos and the autopsy report, how does all of that connect with the night of the UFOs, which happened 2 years before the man in the reservoir was even found? Well, following the night of the UFOs in 1986, farmers in Brazil who lived in the areas where these famous sightings took place began reporting that their cattle were dying kind of inexplicably. And this began happening with enough frequency in all of these areas where the UFO sightings had taken place that a theory began to develop in Brazil that maybe the UFOs that were here during the night of the UFOs have something to do with all these cows turning up dead. And as that theory began to take hold all across Brazil that, UFOs are killing our cattle, another theory began to come out of that one, which was, well, if the UFOs are coming in here and killing cattle, what's stopping them from killing people? And then in 1988, so 2 years after the night of the UFOs, and right in the middle of all these farmers all across Brazil saying their cows were dying for no reason, the dead man in the reservoir was discovered. And as soon as the government saw the physical condition this guy was in, with the weird holes drilled in his body and his organs missing and his face pulled off, that, plus the fact that he was located in this reservoir, which by the way was in a night of the UFO sighting area, the government decided they would have to hide the story. A critical detail that I have left out intentionally until right now is that the cattle who were turning up dead, they were turning up dead with circular holes drilled into their bodies, with organs missing and parts of their faces removed. Meaning, clearly, whatever was happening to these cattle inside of these sighting areas had happened to this man in the reservoir. And if that got out to the public, then it would confirm for many people in Brazil that, yep, the UFOs, they're the ones going after the cattle, and now they're going after us too. And so this was why the police were so secretive about the body and not letting anybody see it or learn anything about it. And it was also why no news was run anywhere in Brazil about this story. It's because the government was really trying to make sure it did not get out. And the government was able to keep it quiet until 1994 when those photos and the autopsy report were leaked. But like all things having to do with UFOs or aliens or paranormal stuff, it's like despite the evidence, those things very quickly are pushed into the kind of conspiracy theory bucket and they stay there. People do not want to touch that category. So even though Brazil remains an absolute hotbed for UFO sightings, Wikipedia even has a page dedicated just to tracking Brazilian UFO sightings. Despite all that, no one really cares. But if you care, there is an unbelievable amount of information online about what's going on in Brazil, and if nothing else, it is just a fascinating rabbit hole to fall into. The next and final story of today's episode is called Jelly. On the afternoon of June 6, 1980, a 56-year-old man named Zygmunt Adamski, who just went by Ziggy, was having a late lunch with his wife and his cousin inside of Ziggy's little brick house in the English village of Tingley. That day had been a particularly stressful day for Ziggy and his family because the following day was Ziggy's goddaughter's wedding, and Ziggy was very close with his goddaughter. Ziggy and his wife couldn't have kids because of medical issues, and so his goddaughter had basically become, at least in Ziggy's mind, like his own daughter. And so in fact, at her wedding, Ziggy was going to be walking her down the aisle. And while Ziggy was really excited about this, he was also very stressed out that he was going to screw it up. And so he had gone over and over, what responsibilities he had as part of the wedding party. And he had this little speech he had to give that he had rehearsed 50 times. He had it written out. I mean, he was ready, but he was very much in his own head about something potentially going wrong that he would be responsible for. And on top of that stress, Ziggy had gotten into a fight that day with his cousin because he felt like the cousin was being kind of disrespectful in some way to his goddaughter. And so Ziggy had stepped up and defended his goddaughter to his cousin. And so there was this undercurrent of tension at the lunch table, not to mention this overarching stress that Ziggy was under about this wedding. And so as Ziggy and his cousin and his wife have this kind of tense meal, Ziggy suddenly realizes that he forgot to get potatoes when he went to the store earlier to buy ingredients for this meal. And for some reason, Ziggy decides, you know what? I'm going to just put my stuff down now, go to the store and get those potatoes, even though at this point it was too late to make the potatoes for the meal. And so maybe Ziggy just wanted to go out and do anything to get away from his cousin for a minute and away from all this wedding planning they were doing and just kind of go out and clear his head. And so Ziggy put his napkin down on the table. He stood up. He told his cousin and wife that he was going out to get potatoes. They were like, okay. And the cousin actually said, do you want me to come with you? Is there anything else you need to get while you're out? And Ziggy said, nope, I'm good. He grabbed some cash out of his wallet and he headed out the door. The village of Tingley, where Ziggy and his wife lived, was a very safe place. He and his wife had actually moved there after fleeing from Poland during World War II, where both Ziggy and his wife, whose name was Lottie, had been held prisoner at some point. And so after all this trauma of being held prisoner and having to flee their home country, they had looked for the safest, best place to kind of resettle and stay for good, and Tingley was it, and they loved it. Ziggy had gotten a job in Tingley as a coal miner, and he had been doing that for 27 years. As for Lottie, she didn't work because she had a disease called multiple sclerosis, which meant she was confined to a wheelchair. But Ziggy and Lottie had quickly made lots of friends in town who were very supportive, and so it wasn't long before Ziggy and Lottie had a very happy and stable life in this town. The little shop where Ziggy was going to was only about 3 blocks away from his house, which meant walking to the store, getting potatoes, and coming back would only take a few minutes. And so Lottie and the cousin back home, they expected to see Ziggy really come back within 10-15 minutes. But when he didn't, and after about 30 minutes went by, Lottie actually got really concerned because Ziggy was just not the type of person to do stuff unannounced. He was incredibly methodical, he was very punctual and reliable, and so being late from this little trip to the store was just so uncharacteristic that Lottie told the cousin, hey, you go to the store and see if Ziggy is there, see what's going on here. Ziggy had worked in the coal mine for nearly 30 years, and he had some serious lung issues from breathing in all of the coal, and so Lottie was thinking, maybe he collapsed or something along the way from these breathing issues. But when the cousin got to the shop owner told the cousin that they had seen Ziggy. He had come in about 25 minutes earlier, he had bought a bag of potatoes, seemed totally normal, everything was fine, and he had left, walking back in the direction of his home. And so the cousin thanked the shopkeeper and then left and began jogging back towards Ziggy's house, thinking, maybe he had just not seen him on the way, that maybe Ziggy was sitting down somewhere on this 3-block path. But the cousin got all the way home and didn't see any sign of Ziggy. And so after going back inside of the house, the cousin and Lottie talked about what they should do, and they actually went back out into the neighborhood asking around, asking neighbors and other people if they had seen Ziggy. But after a couple of hours of canvassing the neighborhood and not finding Ziggy or finding any indication of what happened to him, Lottie ended up calling the police. But the police were not inclined to launch a huge investigation for a grown man who's only been missing for a couple of hours in his neighborhood with no sign of foul play or any other sign that anything really bad had happened. And after the police began asking questions of Lottie and the neighbors about what Ziggy's life was like, they learned that recently Ziggy had been declined for an early retirement from the coal mine. Because of those breathing issues he was having, he had requested to retire now, but they said no. And so Ziggy was really upset about that. He was really stressed about this wedding of his goddaughter the next day. He'd been fighting with his cousin. Also, Ziggy was basically taking care of his wife, who's in this wheelchair all the time. And so because of all these stressors in Ziggy's life, the police started to wonder if maybe it was possible that Ziggy had not been going to get potatoes, but in fact was just kind of abandoning his family. And so ultimately, on the day that Ziggy went missing, the police told Lottie and Ziggy's cousin that they should just sit tight, see if he comes back tonight, and if he doesn't, go to the wedding tomorrow because Ziggy is so close with the goddaughter. If he's having some sort of issue right now, he's very likely to come back for something as significant as this wedding. And so Lottie and Ziggy's cousin stayed at the house all night. Ziggy did not come back. They didn't hear from him. And the next day they went to the wedding, but Ziggy didn't show up for that either, even though he's supposed to walk his goddaughter down the aisle. And so after coming back from this wedding, Lottie called the police, she called local hospitals, she talked to all of her neighbors. She really put out like an all-points bulletin to everybody in the area that something terrible has happened to Ziggy and we need to find him. But despite police beginning to lean into this and her neighbors really going out in force to try to find Ziggy, no one could find him. He had just vanished. On the morning of June 11th, so 5 days after Ziggy went to get potatoes and then vanished, a man named Trevor Parker got to work at his father's coal yard in the English town of Todmorden. The coal yard was basically just this big open lot that had a chain link fence around it that butted up against some railroad tracks. And inside of this lot were just these huge mounds of coal up against the perimeter of the lot. And then also inside of the coal yard was one small office building. And so on this morning, when Trevor pulled through the gates of this coal yard, first of all, he could see the entire yard the second he went in. And as he looked out, all he noticed was the fact that everything was wet from an early morning storm. And so after just kind of surveying around the lot to make sure none of the coal got blown around from the storm, he made his way to the small office building to do some paperwork. Trevor would work inside of that office building for a while, and then around lunchtime, Trevor decided to just go and get some lunch and kind of have a nice long lunch break. And so he left, he went to the pub, he was there for a couple of hours, and then around 3:45 p.m., he came back to the coal yard, and when he went through the gates, everything looked the same, except there was this dark thing on top of one of the coal piles in the back of the yard. Now, Trevor didn't know if he had seen it when he had first arrived that morning, or if it was new, but whatever it was on this pile, it immediately caught Trevor's attention. And so after parking his vehicle, Trevor began walking over to this 12-foot-tall coal pile with this thing on it, and when he got about 30 feet away from it, he realized he saw someone's shoe, that this dark figure was a person, and right away Trevor started rolling his eyes, because there was a group of homeless people that lived near the railroad tracks just outside of the coal yard, and it wasn't uncommon for them to get really drunk and then wander their way into the coal yard, where sometimes they would fall asleep. And so Trevor's thinking, okay, clearly one of these drunk homeless people has found their way into the coal yard and they've passed out on top of this pile of coal. And so instead of going over and talking to this person directly, Trevor just turned around, went back inside of the office building, and he called for an ambulance. The ambulance arrived a few minutes later. They did not have their sirens on. They didn't come flying into the yard. This was a routine thing they were doing. They were scooping up a drunk and bringing them back to the hospital. When the medics got out of their ambulance and Trevor directed them over to the proper coal pile, they were just cracking jokes along the way. This was not a big deal. When the two medics got to the bottom of the coal pile, one of them began climbing up the coal to go see this drunk person and get them down. And so Trevor, as this is happening, he walked a little bit closer, and when he did, he realized that the person who had fallen asleep on the coal, they had really nice pants on, like tailored pants. They were certainly not what Trevor expected this person to be wearing. But before Trevor could even really react to the clothes this person had on, the medic who had climbed up had finally reached this person. They reached down and began trying to move the person around. And suddenly, when they had manipulated this person's body enough, the medic's facial expression completely changed. They went from somewhat routine to totally horrified, and they backed off of this person on the coals. They turned around and ran down the coal, practically falling over themselves. And when they got down there, Trevor heard the medic say to his partner, call the police right now. And Trevor said, what's going on? What did you see? And the medic who had reacted that way just shook his head and walked away to kind of compose himself. And so Trevor at this point was starting to get spooked himself. Clearly, whatever the medic had just seen had really shaken him up. And so Trevor just kind of stood there while the other medic ran in and called police. And then a few minutes later, a police car came flying into the coal yard, and an officer named Alan Godfrey, along with his partner, got out of the car, and right away, the medic, who had gone to the top of the pile and been freaked out by what he saw, walked over with a very ashen face, and he told Alan Godfrey that something was terribly wrong with the person on top of this pile. And so Alan, not really sure what to expect, walked over with his partner to this coal pile, and with the medics and Trevor standing back, Alan, on his own, climbed up the coal, and he looked down at this person. And what Alan saw was a man lying on his stomach wearing a beautiful three-piece brown suit, and Alan immediately noticed that there was absolutely no soot from the coal that this guy was laying on his suit, even though Alan, just to get up here, had basically covered himself in black soot. And so he was wondering, how did this guy get up here and not get covered in soot? It didn't make any sense. Also, Alan noticed that this guy's hair looked totally bizarre. It looked like someone had given him like a really bad haircut with dull scissors, like they just grabbed tufts of his hair and kind of chopped randomly. I mean, his hair was kind of all over the place. There were bald spots. And then as Alan looked from this guy's hair down, he noticed almost hidden in his hairline was this fairly deep wound in the back of his neck that was still bleeding, but there was this weird green jelly-like substance very obviously placed over this wound. And Alan had no idea what the substance was. But as weird as all that was, that didn't explain why the first medic had basically completely panicked and run away. When Alan tried to roll this guy over onto his back to try to wake him up and see if he was okay, he rolled him over and Alan got a look at this guy's face. And immediately Alan let go of him and kind of had to step back for a second because the guy's face was contorted in this frozen look of absolute terror. His jaw was open so wide, it was almost like his lower jaw was dislocated and his teeth were baring and his eyes were bulging out of his head. And so Alan quickly realized that obviously this was not just some drunk homeless person who passed out here. This was a dead person, and whatever happened to them must have been unbelievably terrifying to leave someone looking like that in their death pose. It would turn out this deceased man in the coal yard was Ziggy Adamski. But this did not solve the mystery of what happened to Ziggy 5 days earlier. In fact, his discovery really only created more questions. This town where this coal yard was, Todmorden, was located 25 miles away from where Ziggy lived. And as far as anyone knew, Ziggy didn't know anybody in Todmorden. So there was no reason for him to be there. And number two, when he had left to go get potatoes, he had been on foot. So did he walk 25 miles to this random town? Also, assuming he did just walk to this coal yard is a big, wide open lot that if you were standing anywhere near it, even outside the fence, you could look in and basically see the entire place. So it just seemed really unlikely that Ziggy could just walk into this very public open space and get to the top of one of these coal piles without somebody noticing him. Whether that was Trevor or one of the other employees that were there, or one of the truck drivers that were in and out of there all the time, all day doing deliveries, or the homeless people who were near the railroad tracks, or the people who rode the trains that passed by there every single day. I mean, there are a lot of eyes on this coal yard, but nobody saw Ziggy. It was like he just kind of appeared at the top of this pile. And again, even if Ziggy had managed to slip in and sneak to the top of this pile, why didn't he have soot from the coal all over his clothes? And if maybe he had been brought there, if someone had killed him and put him on this coal pile, there's even more reason he would have soot all over him because they would have had to drag him up to the top of the pile. And even putting all of that aside, if someone really did kill Ziggy and they placed him on this pile, why? This is a very open public place. Someone is going to find him. You're going to get caught if you're the killer. And then, of course, there is the issue of what Ziggy was wearing. That brown three-piece suit he was wearing that had no soot on it, it wasn't his. And it wasn't put on right. The buttons were not lined up. It almost looked like somebody else who didn't know how to put a suit on had tried to dress Ziggy. And then Ziggy also did not have an undershirt on. It was just the jacket over his skin. And then also Ziggy had this totally bizarre haircut that looked like someone who didn't know how to give a haircut had cut his hair with scissors and said, good enough. And then of course you have this wound on the back of Ziggy's neck. Now, the wound itself was determined not to be fatal. It was a fairly deep cut, but it wouldn't have killed him. However, the most significant part of that wound was that green jelly that had been placed across the back of it. During Ziggy's autopsy, they were unable to figure out what this green jelly was, and they ran dozens and dozens of tests on it. And also, during the autopsy, the coroner would determine that Ziggy had actually died the same day he had been found. So he was doing something for 5 days between going missing and being on this coal pile, but nobody knows what it was. And as for his cause of death, the coroner was not entirely sure, but it did seem like he died of a heart attack. The coroner would search all of Ziggy's body for signs of some sort of fight he might have gotten into, some sort of defensive wound on his body, but there was nothing. However, the coroner did find there were very small burns on the back of his neck that were caused by acid, but it was unclear how those got there. When they inspected Ziggy's stomach, they determined that he had been eating and drinking regularly, and so he was not malnourished, he was not dehydrated, he was relatively healthy when he died. He just had this heart attack for unknown reasons, and apparently whatever gave him the heart attack scared him so badly, his face contorted in that horrible way. Ultimately, the coroner just kind of gave up and ruled that Ziggy had died of natural causes, and then the case was closed. But to this day, no one really has any idea how Ziggy went from going out to get groceries to winding up 25 miles away, dressed differently, with this haircut, with this jelly on him and acid burns, dead with this horrible look on his face on this coal pile. It doesn't make any sense. This case has become very famous because people say it is the best example of alien abduction. That Ziggy had left his house to get groceries, got abducted by aliens, and then over 5 days, these aliens did stuff to Ziggy, including cutting into his neck and dropping acid on him, and then they put that green stuff on the back of his neck. They dressed him the way they thought people dressed, in the suit, but they didn't really do it right. And then they literally just dropped him on top of this coal pile, which would explain why he didn't have soot all over him. He was dead, they dropped him, and he just landed on the top of the coal pile. And even if you think that's totally far-fetched, keep in mind, still today, we do not know what that green jelly compound was on the back of his neck. It's literally never been identified, and people have been trying to figure it out for 40 plus years. Also, it's worth noting that one of the responding police officers, Alan Godfrey, claimed to have seen a UFO within weeks of finding Ziggy Adamski.
Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts, MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, and Runfool. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts and you'll find them all. Also, there are hundreds more stories like the ones you heard today, but in video format on our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. There are certain stories that legitimately just seem too strange to be true, and today's story is definitely one of those. But when you get to the end of the story, you'll see that a major American educational institution fact-checked this story really aggressively, and it held up. It really happened. So go into today's very wild story with an open mind. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please offer to read the Amazon Music follow button a bedtime story, but badly mispronounce every fourth word. Okay, let's get into today's story. At the end of December in 1984, in a little village in northern India, a young woman named Sumitra had her first child with her husband. And right away, Sumitra fell in love with her little baby boy. She had always wanted a baby, and now that she had one, she carried him with her everywhere, strapped to her chest. And anytime she had a free hand from cooking or housework, she would use it to pat his head or tickle his feet. Life was not easy for anyone in Sumitra's village, which was located just south of the Himalayan mountains along the Ganges River. Sumitra's village was very poor. People lived in mud huts with thatched roofs, they had no electricity, and basically no one had any formal education. As for Sumitra, her life was especially challenging even relative to her peers, because when she was very young, her mother died, and then her father had to go away all the time for work, and so she was left alone a lot and basically was raised by a cousin. And now, even though she was married, her husband also had to travel quite a bit for work. And so Sumitra, she lived with her husband's parents in their hut, but the reality is she wasn't nearly as close with them as she was with her own family, and her own family was nowhere nearby. And so Sumitra's life was really quite lonely, even as an adult. And so when Sumitra had her baby, it was like for the first time in her life, she didn't feel alone
and she was excited about her life. She was happy that something was finally going the way she wanted it to. But then, one day in early 1985, everything changed. That day, Sumitra, with her son attached to her chest, was walking into town to get water from the well. And as she was walking along the dirt path, she suddenly came to a stop, very rigid, and she dropped her bucket on the ground. A couple of other villagers who were nearby heard the bucket fall. They turned and looked at Sumitra, who was standing there totally rigid. And so one of these villagers, who was very concerned, walked over to Sumitra and asked her what was going on. But Sumitra, she didn't say anything. She just stood there frozen. And this concerned villager looked down at Sumitra's hands, and her fingers were bending back so hard it almost looked like they might break going in the other direction. And then this villager, before asking any more questions, looked up at Sumitra's face, and her eyes had rolled back into the back of her skull, and she had begun grinding her teeth so hard that it was making this loud cracking sound with every movement of her jaw side to side. And so this villager was totally terrified and backed up for a second, and right as they did, Sumitra's baby, who was still strapped to Sumitra's chest, began hysterically crying. And so the combination of Sumitra's baby crying and these other couple of villagers who were staring at Sumitra, who's standing there in this very grotesque pose, attracted the eyes of other nearby villagers. And soon there was a crowd of people just standing there looking at Sumitra, not sure what to do. And then, just as suddenly as Sumitra had fallen into this trance, it stopped, and Sumitra, she kind of shook her head, she fluttered her eyes, and she looked around, and then suddenly became aware that her son is hysterically crying, and also there's this crowd of people all around her, she has no idea why, and so feeling really embarrassed, but again, not knowing what's going on, Sumitra quickly picked up her water bucket, she held her son and hustled out of the crowd of people, and made her way into town where she would get water. When Sumitra came back from the well and was back near her hut, she didn't tell anyone about what had happened on the way to the well. Frankly, she couldn't really remember what happened. And so Sumitra told herself that whatever happened on the trail to the well, that trance she fell into, it had to be a one-time thing, likely brought on by stress and sleeplessness from having a new baby. But a few weeks later, it happened again, and this time the trance lasted quite a bit longer. Sumitra's father-in-law had walked into their kitchen and found Sumitra standing there totally rigid with her hands kind of bending backwards and her eyes rolled back in her skull. And he would tell her later on that he had shaken her and tried to wake her up, but he couldn't for almost 10 minutes. And then when she had snapped out of it, she had no memory and had no idea what happened. By May of 1985, so roughly 5 months after her first trance, Sumitra was falling into these bizarre spells nearly every day, and they were lasting hours at a time. And even more bizarre, lately, during Sumitra's trances, she would begin to speak, and the things she said were totally strange. Typically, she would bark out cries for help. She would say her head was being crushed and someone needed to help her. And then suddenly her voice would drop down to a whisper, and she would say, "All I can see is darkness." Sumitra's family would contact the local medicine man who would come out and examine Sumitra, but he couldn't figure out what was wrong with her. Besides her trances, there seemed to be absolutely nothing wrong with her. She was the picture of good health. And then on July 16th, 1985, so roughly 6 months into these trances, Sumitra would fall into another trance while she was cooking, and during this trance, she would speak. Except when she spoke, she was very calm, and she just said, "In 3 days, I'm going to die." By this point, Sumitra was terrified of whatever was happening to her, and she was totally exhausted, and so was her family. Sumitra had stopped caring for her son, who was now about 8 months old, because she was afraid that at any moment she could fall into a trance and accidentally hurt him. And so her mother-in-law had basically become the boy's mother, and also Sumitra's husband, who was the primary breadwinner for the family, was forced to stop traveling for work and just stay home and help out with Sumitra and his son. Finally, on July 19th, 1985, so this was the day that in her trance Sumitra had predicted she would die, On that day, Sumitra woke up and made a very conscious effort not to do anything that could potentially harm her. She didn't cook because she didn't want to be near flames. She didn't walk near anything with any sort of ledge she could fall off. She didn't even walk downstairs for the same reason. She also kept a very safe distance from her son in order to make sure he was safe. And by late afternoon that day, Sumitra was just fine and there was no sign that anything bad was going to happen to her, and so she and her family began to relax. As Sumitra's mother-in-law began making dinner, Sumitra decided to go outside and get some fresh air. And when she got out there, she saw one of her close friends across the road, and so she waved to her. And as her friend cheerfully began walking closer to Sumitra to say hello, Sumitra suddenly froze, her eyes went back in her skull, her hands became rigid, and she fell into one of her trances. And so this friend, like everyone else in the village, had become quite accustomed to seeing Sumitra in these trances. And so really, the friend was not that concerned when she saw Sumitra doing this. But then Sumitra began doing something in her trance that this friend had never seen before. Sumitra, who normally had her hands by her side during these trances, she began raising her hands up till they reached her forehead, and then wildly Sumitra began clawing at something right above her head, and as she did, her breathing became very loud and labored. And so this friend, feeling suddenly so concerned for Sumitra, rushed over, but when she got right next to Sumitra, there was nothing she could do. Sumitra was just clawing at the sky, breathing really heavily, and then suddenly Sumitra stopped and she put her hands down by her side, and she went back to this rigid pose, and then out of Sumitra's mouth came this horrible, low, rattling moan sound. It was just a constant sound that came out of her, and it got deeper and deeper and deeper until Sumitra's voice kind of cracked, and then suddenly Sumitra went totally still. And when this happened, Sumitra's friend, who was right next to her, realized Sumitra, even though she was standing upright, she was not breathing at all. It was like she was a statue. And so this friend began screaming for help. And so Sumitra's in-laws and her husband and other villagers who heard this cry, they came running outside and they quickly circled around Sumitra. And then a few minutes later, the medicine man arrived. He broke through the circle, went right up to Sumitra and began checking her out. He checked her pulse, he checked her heartbeat, he kind of looked inside of her mouth, he looked in her eyes, and then after a minute, he stepped back and he just said, "She's dead." Sumitra's husband fell to his knees, and Sumitra's mother-in-law, who was carrying Sumitra's son, began crying. All the while, Sumitra's body still remained totally upright and rigid in the middle of all these people, with her hands tight by her side and her eyes rolled back, and her face frozen in what looked like a silent scream. Eventually, the medicine man and Sumitra's father-in-law stepped forward and lowered Sumitra's frozen, rigid body onto the ground on her back, and they closed her eyes. There was no hospital to take Sumitra's body to, or official to call about her death. And in this village at this time, it was very important, for both religious and public health reasons, to take care of the body very quickly. And what that looked like was the villagers would work together to perform the Hindu death rituals, and then afterwards they would cremate the body, which is a process of burning the body until all you have left is the ashes. And so as Sumitra's body lay still rigid on her back right near her home, her family and the villagers began making preparations for her funeral. Sumitra's mother-in-law and some women from the village began scrubbing down Sumitra's body, as well as putting essential oils on her face, and other villagers who were not a part of that went off to find wood for a fire. The villagers weren't talking much, and a lot of the women were crying, but it wasn't just grief they were feeling, it was also fear. They all knew about Sumitra's trances, they happened all the time for months, but what the villagers couldn't wrap their heads around was the idea that during one of these trances, Sumitra had accurately predicted her own death. And so now the villagers couldn't help but think that dark forces were at play here, that maybe Sumitra was possessed, and now whatever had possessed her and killed her is somewhere in the village. And so that night, as the sun started to go down, Normally, kids would be out playing in the village, but their parents said, no, come inside. It's not safe outside. And so for the most part, the only people who were outside that night were the women who were still cleaning and prepping Sumitra's body for her funeral. And at some point, one of the women who was doing this was brushing out Sumitra's hair. And as she did that, she suddenly stopped and she backed up and screamed and pointed at Sumitra. And then the other women all around Sumitra's body, they looked over at what this person was pointing at, and they too saw it and screamed, and everyone began scrambling to try to get away from Sumitra as fast as possible. What all these terrified women were seeing was that Sumitra, her eyes were closed, but her eyes were darting left and right, so her eyelids were kind of fluttering. And then suddenly Sumitra's chest filled with air, and then she breathed out a long, loud exhale, and then she opened her eyes and she sat bolt upright and began looking around. And the other women who were terrified, they're looking at her, and they were struck by how completely healthy and normal Sumitra now looked. Even though for the past 45 minutes, she didn't have a heartbeat and was totally pale and looked completely dead. Sumitra wiped the essential oils from her face, and then she stood up, and as she did, the medicine man, he had heard all the commotion and ran over, and he ran to Sumitra and kind of assisted her and got her to stand on her feet because she was a little bit wobbly. And then the medicine man performed a checkup on Sumitra, checking her heartbeat, her pulse. He looked in her mouth, he looked at her eyes, and then he asked Sumitra, how are you feeling? And Sumitra said, I'm okay. And then the medicine man, he kind of turned to face this now huge crowd of onlooking villagers, and the medicine man had a big smile on his face, and he said, you all have just witnessed a miracle. Sumitra is back from the dead. Sumitra's husband and her in-laws were too shocked to say anything or really even react. But then suddenly, Sumitra's husband was overcome with joy, and he ran forward to hug Sumitra. But as Sumitra turned and saw him coming towards her, she backed up suddenly and put her hands out to protect herself from her husband. And immediately, the medicine man, he kind of stepped in between the husband and Sumitra, and he patted the husband on the shoulder and said, she's been through something very traumatic. You need to give her time and space to recover. And everybody in the village who saw this happen, they were accustomed to whenever Sumitra fell into one of her trances, when she came out of them, she oftentimes was a little bit confused. And so they all just kind of assumed that this is what was happening, but on a bigger scale. This is a really intense trance they've seen, but she's just confused. She'll be okay soon. And so the villagers dispersed, and the medicine man assisted Sumitra back into her hut, and he got her in her bed where she fell asleep. And then afterwards, the medicine man reassured Sumitra's husband and her in-laws that Sumitra, when she woke up, she'd likely be just fine, but he would come by and he would do another thorough medical exam on her just to make sure. And the next morning, when Sumitra woke up, she did seem a lot better. When she left her bedroom, she seemed far less confused than she had been the night before. But as soon as Sumitra saw her husband and her in-laws, she got so scared she just bolted from her hut and started running away. And so the medicine man who had just come by to do his thorough checkup, he saw her take off, and so he began chasing her, as well as Sumitra's husband and father-in-law. They took off after Sumitra. And finally, when Sumitra's husband caught up to Sumitra, he grabbed her by the arm to stop her, and Sumitra ripped her arm away from him, and she said, "How dare you touch another man's wife?" And as the husband kind of ushered Sumitra back towards their house, she continued to say, "You're not my family, this is not my home." And then finally, Sumitra's husband and the medicine man had to literally drag Sumitra to get her to go back inside the hut. And as they dragged her inside, she kept screaming that her name was Shiva Duetti and her in-laws had killed her. Over the next couple of days, the medicine man and Sumitra's family tried everything they could to try to snap her out of what seemed like a really long trance, but nothing they did worked. It seemed like Sumitra had just kind of lost her mind. Sumitra began refusing to touch her beloved son, and instead would demand that someone bring her Rinku and Tinku. But when no one knew who or what she was talking about, Sumitra would just get furious. Sumitra had never gone to school and so did not know how to write. But now, suddenly, in this new trance that she was in, Sumitra would go inside of her bedroom and write these long, totally unhinged sounding letters to total strangers, asking them to come, please take her home. And when she wasn't doing that, she was typically outside in the courtyard, looking at a scar on her foot, wondering how she got it. Sumitra also began wrapping her sari, which is a type of dress fabric, in a new and strange way around her head. She also refused to eat off of any dishes that her family had previously used, and her voice began to sound different. It was higher pitched and much faster, and the way she spoke was always so rude. And so eventually, Sumitra's husband and her in-laws and everybody in the village just kind of resigned themselves to the fact that when Sumitra had not had a heartbeat for 45 minutes when she died, during that time, she likely suffered serious brain damage, or at a minimum, when she kind of came back from the dead, she suffered some kind of psychological break. And so that was why she was acting the way she was. And soon, people just stopped trying to break Sumitra out of this trance she was in, and instead, they all focused on just trying to keep her from running away or hurting herself. And then one day, on October 20th, 1985, so 3 months after Sumitra had died for 45 minutes, Sumitra's family heard a knock on their front door. When Sumitra's husband went to the door and opened it up, he saw there was this older gentleman standing there wearing a suit and nice shoes, standing several feet back from the door, as if he was kind of shy but felt compelled to knock on the door. Now, right off the bat, this man looked totally out of place to Sumitra's husband. Nobody in this village wore suits or nice shoes. In fact, most people, including Sumitra and her family, didn't even wear shoes. But even stranger than what this man was wearing was what he was clutching against his chest. He had this huge leather-bound book with gold trim around the edges that he was holding onto very tightly as if it was very important. And so finally, this strange man, who was visibly nervous and rocking back and forth, began to speak. But his voice was so low, Sumitra's husband had to lean forward just to hear him. The man said his name was Ram Tripathi, and he wanted to know if there was a young woman living in this home who had recently begun acting differently. Sumitra's husband had no idea who Ram Tripathi was. He didn't know this guy. He certainly didn't know where he came from. But what was going through his head was, how is this stranger who's dressed in a funny way, who's got this weird book, how is he aware of the issues my wife is having? And so after a long pause, Sumitra's husband just kind of looks Ram Tripathi up and down a couple of times and then says, "Wait right here. I'll be right back." And then Sumitra's husband turned around, he walked through the hut into Sumitra's bedroom, and kind of matter-of-factly, he said to Sumitra, who was sitting there writing another letter, that there's a strange man outside named Ram Tripathi, and he's asking about you. Sumitra's husband expected Sumitra to just turn and look at him with a blank stare, like she had been doing the last few days. But this time she turned and looked up at him with a huge smile on her face, and then she leapt up and ran to the front door and leapt into the arms of Ram Tripathi. And Ram Tripathi, he was kind of taken aback, still holding his book, not really reacting to what Sumitra was doing. And at some point, Sumitra leans in and whispers something into Ram Tripathi's ear. And Ram Tripathi, he reacted to it very negatively. He kind of looked up at her and looked over at Sumitra's husband like something was wrong. But Sumitra's husband couldn't tell what Sumitra had said. And so the whole situation made no sense to Sumitra's husband. And apparently it also made no sense to Ram Tripathi. And so pretty quickly, Ram Tripathi kind of pushed Sumitra off of him and took a few steps back and looked at Sumitra and said, "What's your name?" And Sumitra is now looking at Ram Tripathi with a look of anger and betrayal on her face. And she says, "My name is Shiva Dwivedi." Ram Tripathi, after hearing this, did not respond and instead just kind of gestured over to a low wall just outside of their house for he and Sumitra to go sit down on. And so he walked over and Sumitra followed him. They sat down, and Sumitra's husband, he walked over, but he stayed a couple of feet back standing up. And once Ram Tripathi was sitting down, he lowered his big leather-bound book and he opened it up, and inside were all these photographs. And right away, Ram Tripathi pointed at one of the pictures, which contained a bunch of people in it, and he turned to Sumitra and he said, "Can you identify who's in this photo?" And Sumitra, she looked at the photo and immediately began rattling off names that were all correct. These are people that Sumitra's husband, he's looked over, and he's got no idea who the people are in that photo. And so after Sumitra correctly identifies that photo, Ram Tripathi turns the page, he picks out another photo, and he says, "Can you identify who's in this photo?" And again, Sumitra, one by one, would name correctly all the people in the photo. And then finally, Ram Tripathi took a sigh, and he flipped the page one more time, and he pointed to one particular picture which contained one person. And he looked at Sumitra and he said, "Do you know who this is?" And Sumitra, she would look over at the photo, and instead of immediately saying the name, she paused, and she kind of began to breathe heavy, and she seemed kind of angry. And then she looked at Ram Tripathi and she said, "I know who that is. That's my sister-in-law, and she killed me by hitting me over the head with a brick." And at this, Ram Tripathi dropped his book on the ground, and he turned and embraced Sumitra as hard and as intensely as she had when she had run out and leapt into his arms. And he and Sumitra, they hugged and cried for a long time. And then finally, when they separated, Ram Tripathi turned to Sumitra's husband, who's still just standing there totally bewildered, and he tells him, "Let's go inside and I'll explain everything." Once Ram Tripathi was inside with Sumitra and her family, he told them an unbelievable story about a woman named Shiva Dwivedi. Shiva Dwivedi was, of course, the name that Sumitra for months had been saying was her own. But over those few months, her family had just assumed that that name meant nothing and that what she was saying was nonsense because of her brain injury. But Ram Tripathi would tell them that Shiva Dwivedi was the name of a young woman who lived in a city none of them had ever heard before, located about 60 miles away from their village. He would tell them that Shiva was a very wealthy woman who was college educated, and she had 2 young sons. And it would turn out that Shiva's youngest child was born almost on the same day that Sumitra's child was born, in December of 1984. But unlike Sumitra, who after the birth of her child felt like her life got so much better, she loved her family, she was excited about the future, for Shiva, it was the opposite. When her first child arrived, it was like her life got worse and worse and worse. Shiva's in-laws had grown to hate her. They didn't like that she was so well educated, and they hated the family she came from. And so by early 1985, when by this point Sumitra was regularly falling into those trances with her eyes rolling back and her teeth gnashing, the tension and fighting in Shiva's home 60 miles away was reaching an almost unbearable level. Shiva began writing these long letters that she would send to her family far away, where she would detail waking up almost every night with nightmares screaming. And in May of 1985, which is when Sumitra began speaking during her trances, Shiva got into the biggest fight she had ever gotten into with her in-laws about attending a family wedding. And on the night of May 18th, 1985, Shiva's neighbors in her city saw Shiva's in-laws literally carrying Shiva's body, which appeared to be unconscious, as they walked along the railroad tracks. When these neighbors ran up and asked if everything was okay with Shiva, Shiva's in-laws just said, "Oh, she's sick and we're taking her to the hospital." Now, it was nighttime, there were no lights around, and so it was really dark, and these neighbors couldn't get a good look at Shiva to see, what was going on with her. And so even though they thought this was very strange, they decided not to say anything. The next morning, Shiva's dead body was found lying on the train tracks right near the train station. And so someone raised the alarm, and before long, Shiva's uncle and sister ran to the train station, and when they got there and saw Shiva on the tracks, they also saw Shiva's in-laws were already there. And when they spoke to Shiva's in-laws, they told the uncle and the sister that it looks like Shiva must have jumped in front of a train to commit suicide. But the uncle and sister are looking down at Shiva's body, and there appeared to be really no markings, bruises, cuts of any kind on her body that you would expect from getting hit by a train, except Shiva did have a very big mark on her head. Later on, the uncle and sister would say it looked like something had bashed Shiva's head in. Shiva's in-laws would immediately cremate Shiva's body before Shiva's actual family could stop them, and the police in this area were not good at investigating crime. So when Shiva's in-laws went to them and said, yep, she jumped in front of a train, she committed suicide, but we don't have a body because we already cremated her, the police just accepted it. Shiva's father was convinced that Shiva had been murdered, but he didn't have a way to prove it. Until Sumitra appeared to die on July 19th, 1985, and then came back to life, claiming to be Shiva. Shiva's father had heard a rumor about some girl in a village 60 miles away claiming to be his dead daughter. Now, at first, Shiva's father did not believe this, but eventually he decided he would go to the village and test this girl to see if maybe it was true. And so, on October 20th, 1985, Shiva's father put on his best suit and his nicest shoes, he brought his leather-bound photo book, and he headed to Sumitra's village and knocked on her hut. Ram Tripathi was Shiva's dad. When Sumitra at first ran outside and leapt onto Ram Tripathi and hugged him and then whispered something into his ear that Sumitra's husband saw happening but couldn't hear what she said, and then Ram Tripathi, when he heard what she whispered, he kind of recoiled and acted angry for a second, what Sumitra was saying was, Papa. In the moment, Ram Tripathi, who was not convinced Sumitra was his daughter, felt like this is a horrible, elaborate hoax and it needs to stop. But then Sumitra correctly identified 15 people in his leather-bound photo album, including the sister-in-law who she said killed her. And even more convincing than that was that Sumitra knew how Shiva had been killed, by getting smashed over the head with a brick. This was a question that Ram Tripathi had never heard the answer to before. And at that point, Ram Tripathi believed that this must be his daughter's reincarnated spirit inside of Sumitra. And so that was when he dropped the book and gave her a big hug. This story is considered to be one of the most credible reincarnation stories ever recorded. Scientists from the University of Virginia in America actually went to India to study Sumitra and interview everybody involved. And they concluded that this was not a hoax. They said that Sumitra had most likely either been possessed by or reincarnated as Shiva Dwivedi. The change in Sumitra's voice that her family noticed was the same accent that Shiva had. It was very urban and educated. The strange new way that Sumitra wrapped her sari on her head was the same way that Shiva did. Sumitra was rude to her family and refused to eat off the same dishes as them because she believed she was actually a very wealthy woman who was for some reason being forced to live in this poor person's hut. And when Sumitra asked for Tinku and Rinku, those were nicknames that Shiva had given her two sons. And all those seemingly unhinged letters that Sumitra had written and fired off to random strangers were in fact sent to various members of Shiva's family. After Shiva's father, Ram Tripathi, brought Sumitra's story to the police would actually investigate this case, and they would charge some members of Shiva's family. But ultimately, Sumitra's testimony was deemed unacceptable for court, and so the case was never officially solved. As for Shiva's in-laws, they have always denied killing her. Sumitra lived the entire rest of her life as Shiva, and Shiva's real parents accepted her as their daughter. Sumitra also came to accept her son and raised her son with her husband in their little village until she died in 1998. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out the rest of our studio's podcasts, MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, and Runful. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts. If you want to watch hundreds more stories just like the one you heard today, head to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. My wife is a total skeptic. She does not believe in the paranormal whatsoever and never has. But when I told her just a portion of today's story, specifically the part about the passenger in first class, you'll know when you get to that scene, she told me she was so intrigued by it. And I think the reason for that is in this story, as you'll see, there were so many witnesses, hundreds of witnesses. And so how could they all be making this up? But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please invite the Amazon Music follow button to a Ouija board session, and once everyone's fingers are on the pointer, ask if anyone likes the Amazon Music follow button, and then subtly move the pointer over no. Okay, let's get into today's story. Around 8:30 p.m. on December 29, 1972, passengers inside of JFK International Airport in Queens, New York, heard over the intercom that Eastern Airlines Flight 401 to Miami was now boarding. About 30 minutes later, all 176 passengers, which included the 13 crew members, had made it on board, and then at that point, the 13 crew members began making their final preparations for takeoff. Flight 401 was a very expensive and recently introduced model of plane by Eastern Airlines called the Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, and it was both unbelievably technologically advanced and unbelievably enormous. It sat up to 400 passengers, which meant instead of having 4 seats to a row like you would expect inside of a passenger jet, the L-1011s had 8 seats per row, and they had 2 levels. There was the main level, which was the main cabin where all the passengers were, and then there was a second level, a lower level, that was only accessible via 2 small elevators that could barely fit 1 person inside of them in the back of the aircraft. And down on this lower level was a full-size kitchen, which had ovens and refrigerators, and also at the back of this lower level was a lounge area for flight staff. The pilot that night was Bob Loft, who was a strikingly handsome 55-year-old man with over 30,000 hours of flying experience, which for reference is a ton of flying experience. Captain Bob was known as a perfectionist who exuded confidence and who was cool under pressure. After Bob had boarded the aircraft, he had made his way right into the cockpit, which is the very front of the plane where the pilots fly the plane, and he had sat down in the customary captain's seat, which was the front left seat. And then after he had sat down, his 10 years younger first officer or co-pilot, a man named Bert Stockstill, had joined him in the cockpit and sat down in the customary co-pilot seat, which was directly to the right of Captain Bob. And so after the pilot and co-pilot were both seated, the remaining 2 members of that night's cockpit crew came into the cockpit. Now, normally in most passenger jets, there were only 2 seats in the cockpit, but because L-1011 planes were so massive, there were 4 seats in the cockpit. And so one of the last 2 men who joined the cockpit was 51-year-old Don Repo, who was the flight's engineer. And despite him being this big, strong ox of a man, he was actually known as being fairly soft-spoken and very approachable. And so Don came into the cockpit, he said hello, and then he sat down in the seat right behind the co-pilot, Bert. And then a few seconds after Don, the last man came into the cockpit. It was 47-year-old Angelo Donadeo. Angelo was not actually part of that night's flight crew. However, he was an employee of Eastern Airlines, and that night he needed to get to Miami, and so the company had put him on Flight 401 and sat him in the fourth and final seat in the cockpit, right behind Captain Bob. Around 9:10 p.m., all pre-flight checks had been completed, all passengers were seated, as was the crew, and so Captain Bob began taxiing over to the runway. 10 minutes later, at 9:20 p.m., Captain Bob pushed the throttles forward, and the plane began to take off. A few minutes later, and Flight 401 was airborne up in the night sky over New York, headed south towards Miami. For the next 2 hours, this flight was completely normal. In fact, it was so normal that one of the passengers, named Jerry Escow, actually wrote a letter while he was on the plane, telling Eastern Airlines how great their airline was and how smooth this flight was. His plan was, once they landed, to mail this letter to Eastern Airlines. But at 11:32 p.m., so 2 hours and 12 minutes after takeoff, this flight would go from being very routine and normal to being anything but. At 11:32 p.m., Captain Bob began his approach to Miami International Airport, but when he lowered the plane's landing gear, his co-pilot Bert noticed they had a problem. L-1011 jets, like 401, have 3 pieces of landing gear. They have wheels that come down under the left wing, they have wheels that come down under the right wing, and they have wheels that pop out of the nose of the plane. And each of these pieces of landing gear has a corresponding little light bulb, a green light bulb, inside the cockpit that once that piece of landing gear comes down and locks in place and is ready to be landed on, its green light will go on inside of the cockpit. But when Captain Bob lowered their landing gear, his co-pilot, Bert, noticed only 2 of the lights came on. The one that did not light up was the nose landing gear. Now, Captain Bob and the other men in the cockpit, when they saw this issue, they immediately assumed it had to be the light bulb itself that was faulty, not the actual nose landing gear, because this plane was brand new, it had been checked before they left, so the likelihood of the nose landing gear being faulty was incredibly slim. And so Captain Bob, while maintaining his approach towards Miami International, he retracted the landing gear, and then once it had come back into the plane, he just lowered it again, thinking this time all 3 lights would come on. But once again, once the landing gear was deployed the second time, still the nose landing gear light did not come on. And so frustrated, Captain Bob hopped on the radio and contacted Miami Air Traffic Control and told them that he could not confirm his landing gear was actually safe to land on, and so they would have to circle around for a bit in the sky and get it figured out. And so Miami Air Traffic Control acknowledged what Captain Bob said and then directed Captain Bob to fly out over the nearby Everglades, which is a massive wetlands area in Florida, and to stay out over the Everglades away from other traffic until they fixed the problem. And so once Flight 401 was out over the Everglades flying in a circular pattern, Captain Bob and his co-pilot set the plane to autopilot so that it would maintain a constant altitude of 2,000 feet and a constant speed of 200 miles per hour. And so once the plane was all set, Captain Bob and his co-pilot Bert began fiddling with this front nose gear indicator light bulb, which they were convinced was faulty. And so they started by pressing on the light, and when that didn't work, they began twisting it, and when that didn't work, they actually pulled the light bulb off the panel and kind of blew the dirt and grime off of it, and then they jammed it back into the panel, but as soon as they did, not only did it not go back on, but they realized they had put it in sideways, and so they couldn't actually get it out again. And so now they're thinking, this light's not going to go on at all, we need to find another way to make sure the nose landing gear has come down. And so Captain Bob at this point is totally frustrated, and so he turns around and he looks at Don Repo, the flight engineer who's sitting right behind the co-pilot, and he tells Don to go down into the hellhole and directly inspect the front landing gear himself. So the hellhole is a space right below the cockpit, and the way you get to it is through a trap door in the floor in the center of the cockpit. And then once down in the hellhole, there is this window that looks straight towards the front of the aircraft where you could look out and actually see the front landing gear and you could make sure it was down or not. And so Don Repo, he gets out of his seat and he opens up the hellhole trap door and he makes his way down below. Meanwhile, 2,000 feet below Flight 401, a 43-year-old man named Robert Marquise, along with a friend of his, were looking for frogs in the Everglades riding around on Robert's airboat. An airboat is a flat-bottom boat with this huge fan on the back of it that propels it forward. It's popular in the Everglades because the water depth is so shallow. At points in the Everglades, the water's only a couple of inches deep. And so all around these two guys, it is totally pitch black out. There are no buildings or people for miles and miles and miles. Their only light source is Robert's headlamp. And so at some point, Robert turns off the airboat, and he and his friend are just standing in the middle of it, kind of scanning around on either side. And all around them, they can hear the sound of alligators growling and snakes and frogs moving about the tall grass. And as they're just kind of silently looking around them, out of the corner of Robert's eye, he sees something. And so he looks up right as he sees this huge orange and yellow flash that kind of came out of the ground roughly 5 miles away from where they were. And basically, as soon as Robert saw it, this flash dissipated and it was just totally gone. And so he turned to his friend who had not seen this flash. And Robert said, "Hey, let's go investigate. Let's see what that was." And so Robert fired up his boat again and he began flying across the Everglades straight in the direction of where he saw this flash. And after 15 minutes of cruising at 40 miles per hour across this dark expanse, they reached the area where this flash had been, and Robert and his friend, they just could not believe what they were looking at. About 20 minutes earlier, back up inside of Flight 401, when Captain Bob turned around in his seat to tell the flight engineer, Don Repo, to go down into the hellhole, it's believed that Captain Bob nudged the steering wheel with his leg. And this little nudge was enough to disengage the plane's autopilot, which sent the plane into a gradual descent. But nobody noticed. Because, one, it was totally pitch black outside, the Everglades below them, there's no lights, there's nothing, and there was no moon that night, and so when they're looking out the window, there would have been no visual cues that they were going down, up, or anything. It just would have looked like a total void outside. And two, the descent they were now suddenly in was so gradual, it would not have felt like they were tumbling out of the sky. It would have felt like they were just cruising as expected. And three, all of the men in the cockpit were completely fixated on this light bulb problem. In fact, they were so fixated that when an alarm went off inside of the cockpit, telling them they had dipped below their intended altitude of 2,000 feet, they were now going down, nobody noticed. Although, to their credit, this alarm only sounded once and it wasn't that loud. And so not long after Don Repo had gone down into the hellhole, the plane crashed into the Everglades. No one on board Flight 401, from the cockpit crew to the passengers to the other flight staff, had any idea they were in an emergency until they hit the ground. And when they hit the ground, the plane exploded, and that was what Robert Marquis saw when he looked up and saw that yellow and orange flash. And so Robert and his friend, they speed over to the crash site, and when they get there, they are the first ones there. And even though they're looking out and they can hear the sound of all these people screaming and crying and moaning, they can't see anything because the fire from this huge explosion was already out because the swampy wetlands had pretty much immediately extinguished it. And even though the plane had crashed into the ground at over 200 miles per hour, it had not struck the ground at a very steep angle because basically the plane was in this gradual descent pattern and just kind of coasted until it hit the ground. And so that, combined with the soft, muddy ground of the Everglades, meant that the impact of the plane hitting the ground was not nearly as violent as other plane crashes were. And that ultimately saved lives. In fact, dozens of passengers survived the initial impact with the ground. But many of them were left with these horrible injuries, or they were trapped within the wreckage, or both. When Robert and his friend arrived at the edge of the crash scene, Robert lifted up his headlamp and began to scan, and he saw all these body parts sticking out of the ground, and then his light rested on the first survivor he saw, and it was this man whose clothes had been completely burned off from the explosion. All he had on was just a little bit of his socks on both ankles. And this man was still strapped into the seat that he had been on the plane, and when the plane had broken up, his seat had fallen forward into the mud, pinning this man's upper body and most of his face under several inches of water. And so as Robert had scanned over with his light had hit this man's face, and he had looked up and pleaded with Robert and his friend to come get him before he drowned. And so Robert and his friends, they jumped off their boat and ran over to this guy and pulled the chair up and out of the water, saving this guy's life. But as soon as he was up and out of the water, Robert and his friend began hearing more calls from other people in the darkness screaming for help. Robert and his friend would do their absolute best to save as many people as they possibly could, but there was just too many people who needed saving and not enough time. About 30 minutes after Robert and his friend had arrived at the scene, the Coast Guard showed up in helicopters, and they, along with Robert and his friend, would spend the entire night pulling as many people to safety as they possibly could. By the time the sun came up on the following day, there were no other survivors left to save. All told, 99 people perished and 77 survived. Amongst the dead were Captain Bob Loft and his co-pilot Bert Stockstill and their flight engineer Don Repo, who had gone down into the hellhole. Amongst these survivors was Angelo Donadeo, the fourth man in the cockpit, as well as Jerry Ascow, the man who ironically had written that letter to Eastern Airlines saying how wonderful that flight had been. A major investigation following the crash would confirm that the reason Flight 401 went down was because of a number of factors, most notably human error. The investigation would also confirm that the nose landing gear was working perfectly fine. The light bulb not coming on was a result of the light bulb being burned out. Following the investigation, Eastern Airlines would make every effort to compensate both the survivors of the crash and also families of those who were killed in the crash. Eastern Airlines would also make major changes to their training for their pilots and co-pilots and anybody that was ever going to be in the cockpit to ensure this type of disaster never happened again. But this was not the end of the story for Flight 401. For almost 3 years after the crash, hundreds of Eastern Airline employees began to experience a terrifying phenomenon. Now, at first, many of these employees were going to their superiors and reporting what happened to them, but very early on, Eastern Airlines made it clear that they didn't want anybody to talk about this. Anytime an employee made one of these reports about this phenomenon, they were either sent to the psychiatrist or they were just fired. However, despite this intense pressure from Eastern Airlines to their employees to be quiet about what was going on inside of their ranks, there were still some very brave employees who had firsthand experience with this terrifying phenomenon who still came forward and told their stories to the press and to journalists. They just did it anonymously. And so I'm going to tell you 2 of the most chilling accounts from those employees. Keep in mind, the names used in these stories have all been changed. In March of 1973, so 3 months after Flight 401 had crashed in the Everglades, an Eastern Airlines flight attendant named Ginny was assigned to a flight from New York to Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Working with her on this flight was her very close friend and fellow flight attendant, a woman named Denise. Neither of these 2 women were on Flight 401 when it crashed. The plane these 2 women would be working on their flight to Florida was called number 318 by Eastern Airlines, and it was an L-1011 just like Flight 401 had been. In fact, plane number 318 actually had some original parts from Flight 401 on it, because it would turn out after that huge investigation was done on the crash, the investigators discovered lots of parts from Flight 401 were still in pretty good shape. And so after rigorously testing them and ensuring they did really work, those parts were actually installed on other L-1011 jets in the Eastern Airline fleet. Now, for the record, this was not considered an inappropriate thing to do. These parts were extremely expensive and they worked perfectly fine and they were not involved in causing Flight 401 to crash. And so no one batted an eye when Eastern Airlines put these parts on their other planes. So Ginny and Denise, along with several other Eastern Airlines flight attendants, board plane number 318, and after takeoff, the flight attendants began going through the very long and drawn-out process of getting food and drink for the nearly 200 people on board the flight. And so the way the flight attendants divvied up the work is they would have some of the attendants on the main level of the plane in the cabin taking orders from all the passengers, and then the other flight attendants would be down on the lower level, the second level of the plane where the kitchen was, preparing all the food and drinks. And so at some point during this process, Denise, who was up on the main level helping with taking orders, realized she didn't have anything to do. She had taken all the orders she could, and so she decided she would head down to the second level, to the kitchen, where her good friend Ginny was, to see if she could help her. But ironically, as Denise got in the elevator in the back of the plane and began heading down to the second level, Ginny, who was on the second level, discovered she did not have anything to do. She'd already prepped her cart, and so she had gotten into the other elevator and began going up to the main level to see if Denise needed any help. And so the two women literally passed each other in their elevators, but didn't see each other. And so once Ginny arrived at the main level, the cabin level, she got off the elevator and she walked down the aisle and she began asking around to the other attendants if they knew where Denise was. And they would tell her, oh, she just left a minute ago to go down to see you. And so after a couple of minutes, Ginny would leave the main level and go back down the elevator to the lower level to find Denise. Now, to understand what happens next, you need to have a basic understanding of the layout of the second level. So when you come down on either of those two elevators, when the doors open, you'd be looking down a stretch of hallway, basically the length of the plane from the back towards the front. And when you stepped off the elevator, you'd be stepping into the middle of the kitchen. Now, the kitchen was very, very cramped, and on the left side was a row of ovens that were all stacked up against each other. And then on the other side, on the right side, was a row of cabinets and cupboards. If you were to walk down the kitchen straight towards the front of the plane, you would eventually reach a wall that separated the kitchen to the lounge area, and there was a door slightly off to the right side on this wall that you could walk through to get into the lounge. So if you were standing in the kitchen and looking in the direction of this door, you wouldn't really be able to see into the lounge area because, again, the door was kind of off to the side. You would have to actually go over to the door and poke your head through to get a full unobstructed view of the lounge. And all the lounge was a couple of sofas and chairs kind of arranged in a circle. So Ginny has gotten back in the elevator and she's made her way back downstairs to continue looking for Denise. She gets down to the lower level, the doors open up, and she looks out into the kitchen and Denise is not there. In fact, the kitchen is totally empty. And the door leading into the lounge area is shut. So she can't even see in part of the way into the lounge to see if anybody is in there. But the second Ginny stepped off the elevator into the kitchen, she immediately had this powerful sense that Denise was definitely down there somewhere on the second level with her, probably in the lounge area that she couldn't see. And because Ginny felt so confident that Denise was down there, she actually didn't start by calling out for Denise or walking to the door, opening it up, and looking into the lounge to make sure Denise was there. Instead, Ginny just turned to the left and went to the ovens and began preparing food for the attendants upstairs. And as she's making these plates of food, Ginny would periodically look over at the closed door leading into the lounge, kind of expecting it to open up at any point and see Denise walk out. But after a couple of minutes, no one had opened the door from the lounge, and Ginny was thinking to herself, I'm making quite a bit of noise over here. If anybody was down here, wouldn't they come out of the lounge and just see who it was? And because Ginny, again, had this really intense feeling that she was not alone down there, she began to think, wait a minute, is Denise playing a practical joke on me? Is she hiding in the lounge? Or is she hiding in one of the cabinets on the right side here, and she's going to jump out and grab me? And so the second Ginny began thinking about that, she became really paranoid. And so as she's making this food, she's pretty much constantly looking over at the door or kind of scanning behind her, waiting for Denise to launch out and scare her. But again, after several more minutes, Ginny didn't see anybody come out of the lounge and none of the cabinet doors opened up. It was just her down there. However, the longer she stayed down there, the stronger that feeling got that someone was in the room with her. And so now she can't even make her food. She's completely turned around, just scanning all around the kitchen, really at this point, hoping Denise jumps out to scare her. And when Denise didn't do that, Ginny just began walking over to the door that would lead into the lounge. And so when she reached the door, her heart was racing like mad. She reached down to the handle, she turned it, she pushed it open, and she poked her head in real quick, and there was no one in the lounge. But immediately, the second her head was in that room, that feeling that someone was down there with her spiked, and she got chills all over her body. and she ran into the back of the lounge and looked behind all of the chairs and sofas, praying at this point that Denise was going to be down there. But after looking all over the back of the lounge, there was no one there. And so finally, Ginny turns around and she's totally racked with fear. Because now she's on the very far end of the lounge. There's no one in the lounge. She knows there's no one in the kitchen. And here she is still getting that sensation that she was not alone down there. But she has to go all the way back across the lounge, through that door, into the kitchen to get back to the elevator so she can escape. And so Ginny almost instinctively moved immediately to the left side of the lounge and put her back up against the wall to make sure no one could be behind her. And then she began slowly inching her way along the left wall towards the door that was now open that would lead back into the kitchen. And as she's slowly shimmying along, her view of the kitchen is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And the whole time she's thinking, I'm going to see someone in the kitchen because this sensation that someone is down here with me is not going away. But when she finally gets to the door and crosses into the kitchen, there's still no one there. And so she makes a run at that point to the elevator. She starts hitting the button. And as she's hitting the button, she's turning around and she has that awful feeling that someone's right behind her. And then finally the car comes down. She hops inside the elevator. She shuts the doors. She hits the button and she begins going back up. When the elevator cart got back to the main level and the doors opened again, Ginny almost knocked over the flight attendant that was standing right outside of it, a woman named Mildred. And after Mildred and Ginny kind of regained their balance, they both looked at each other, and Mildred could see very clearly that Ginny looked horrible. She was totally pale, she was sweating. And so Mildred said, Ginny, are you okay? What's going on? And Ginny would just say, I don't know. I can't tell you what's going on. I don't know. But Mildred, instead of asking follow-up questions, just said, Ginny, you need to come with me. And so Ginny would follow Mildred, who led them back around behind the elevators to the space in the back of the plane, kind of out of view of the passengers. And there, Ginny would find Denise. And Denise looked pale as a ghost. She was sweating and looked totally shaken up. It would turn out when Ginny left the lower level for the first time to come up to the main level to look for Denise, and then learned that Denise was not up there, that Denise had actually gone down to look for Ginny. In those few minutes that Ginny was up on the main level before she went back down again to continue looking for Denise, Denise was on the lower level. And Denise would say when she got off the elevator into the kitchen, there was no one down there, but immediately she believed Ginny had to be down there because of the strong sense that she was not alone down there. However, when she opened up the door to look into the lounge, she didn't see anyone and it totally spooked her. She shut the door, she ran back to the elevators, and she went back upstairs. And as she was going up in her elevator car, who, once again, passed her in the other elevator car? Ginny. And so once again, the two women did not see each other. And so these two women, who had never experienced anything like this before in their lives, had nearly identical experiences, totally independent of each other, just a couple of minutes apart, in the exact same space. It was just too many coincidences for them to totally write it off. And so that was a big reason why they felt like they had to come forward with their information. 1 month later, plane number 318, the same plane that Ginny and Denise had had their frightening experiences on, was at Newark Liberty International Airport in New Jersey, undergoing pre-flight checks from its crew before its flight to Miami that morning. After most of the checks were done, the passengers were allowed to board the plane, and then after it seemed like most of the passengers had arrived and taken their seats, the senior flight attendant, whose name was Sis, began counting the people on board the plane to make sure they had everyone. And after counting up and down the rows, she realized their head count was off by 1. They had one too many people. And so when Sis began recounting, she actually quickly identified the discrepancy. Sis was standing in first class in the aisle, and as she was counting down the left side of first class passengers, she noticed there was an Eastern Airlines captain seated in one of the seats. And so immediately Sis thought, oh, okay, I don't recognize this person, but since he's in uniform, he must be deadheading. Deadheading is a fairly common practice for airline employees where if they need to be on a particular flight but are not physically at the origin airport, they will just hop on another company flight that happens to be going to the airport they need to go to. And at least in the 1970s, it was not uncommon for employees not necessarily to tell the flight staff until they were literally on the plane, because these employees would just check the manifest, see if there were openings, and then climb on board. And so Sis assumed that was exactly what this man had done, and that was why he was unaccounted for, and it was why they had this extra person. And so she just needed to get his name to account for him. And so Sis turned and took a couple of steps until she was right in front of this guy who was still just seated looking straight ahead, and Sis introduced herself and asked him if he was deadheading. But the captain just continued to stare straight ahead and didn't even seem to register that Sis was talking to him, despite the fact that Sis was right on top of him and speaking very, very clearly and nobody else was talking. And so Sis, who was aware of the fact that this guy clearly should have heard her, just kind of waited for a second and then just asked again, hey, what's your name? I need to make sure that you are in fact deadheading. But again, this captain just sat there without moving and didn't remotely react to Sis. Now, by this point, another flight attendant named Diane had looked over and actually saw Sis having this strange interaction with this Eastern Airlines captain. And so Diane walked over and listened as Sis, for a third time, tried to get this guy's attention, but he still did nothing. And so Diane and Sis, they start looking at each other like, what do we do about this? And at some point, Sis just says, okay, I'm going to go tell the captain, he can deal with this. And so Diane stayed in the aisle next to this silent seated captain while Sis turned and walked towards the cockpit, and she told the captain, whose name was George. And so George, he leaves the cockpit with Sis by his side, and they start walking down the aisle back towards where this guy was and where Diane was. And by the time they get there, 6 other passengers kind of in the general vicinity had noticed something strange was going on. And so they were all kind of turned around in their seats, looking at this captain who was sitting there, and Diane and Sis and George kind of waiting to see what was going to happen. And so George and Sis, they walk right up alongside Diane and this seated silent captain, and George immediately crouched down to get a good look at this guy's face. Because again, this captain is just looking straight ahead with a hat on, and so no one had really looked at him yet. And so George kneels down and he sees this guy's face for the first time, and he falls over and goes, "Oh my God, that's Bob Loft!" The same Bob Loft who had died on Flight 401, the captain of Flight 401. George had known Bob really well and knew exactly what Bob looked like. But before Bob, Sis, Diane, or the 6 other passengers that were all watching could do anything, the seated, silent captain that looked exactly like Bob Loft vanished into thin air right in front of all of them. And immediately, these 6 passengers on board the flight that saw this happen became hysterical. They could not understand what they had just seen. People are screaming and crying, and George, Diane, and Sis, they were very shaken at what they saw, but they knew they were in charge of this flight. And so they tried to calm down the passengers, but then very quickly, they organized a search of the plane because they're telling themselves, no one can just disappear into thin air. This guy has to be somewhere on the plane. And so for over an hour, the passengers were told to stay in their seats and were told to stay calm while the flight crew searched every crevice, every nook and cranny of this flight to see if they could find this guy. But they never did. And so after a very long delay, plane number 318, along with its very shaken up passengers and flight crew, eventually rumbled out onto the runway and took off. When they landed in Miami, the first thing George, Diane, and Sis all did is they went in and filed a report about what they had seen, about this vanishing person. But Eastern Airline didn't do anything about their reports. In fact, the logbook where these reports were kept was conspicuously missing a couple of weeks later when some other employees of the airline heard about this vanishing person and wanted to read the reports themselves. And when these employees went to their superiors and asked if they could get this logbook, the answer from the top was, George, Diane, and Sis never filed those reports. There was no vanishing person. This whole thing is a bunch of crap. But George, Diane, and Sis all said, we filed those reports. And apparently some other pilots within Eastern Airlines had actually seen the reports before the logbook went missing. And they would tell other people that what they read was terrifying. Over the next 2 years, there would be an astounding number of other totally unexplainable events that took place on other planes within Eastern Airlines' fleet. However, the strange events only occurred on L-1011 jets that had parts on them from the crashed Flight 401. Some of these unexplained events included more sightings of the silent seated captain who looked just like Bob Loft. And in fact, one of those sightings was by an Eastern Airlines executive who, after seeing this captain vanish into thin air right in front of him, the executive freaked out and ran off the plane and demanded the plane be searched top to bottom. But like the last search, nothing was found. On another occasion, the catering company that loaded food directly into the second level of these L-1011s, basically right into the kitchen, one of their staff spotted a man wandering around the lower level that looked just like Don Repo, the flight engineer from the doomed Flight 401. And when this staff member spoke to this man who looked like Don Repo turned towards him and then vanished into thin air. The catering company was so scared when this happened that they refused to go back into the plane, and it caused a massive delay. On another flight, on board plane number 318, the pilot and co-pilot began hearing banging coming from the hellhole, and when the pilot got up and opened up the hellhole and went down below and shined his light, he didn't see anything. But when he went to climb back up into the cockpit, he looked up, and standing in the cockpit was once again Don Repo looking straight down at him, who then promptly vanished right in front of him. On another flight, a female passenger in coach, who had been quiet the entire flight, suddenly began screaming hysterically. And when they went up to her and asked her what was wrong, she was pointing at the seat next to her and said a man had suddenly appeared right next to her. He did not walk in, he just appeared next to her, and then when she began screaming, he vanished right in front of her. This woman was so upset that when they landed finally in Phoenix, Arizona, she had to be restrained in a straitjacket when they pulled her off the plane. But as terrifying as all of these events were, there was at least one instance where these apparitions appeared to be helpful to the people on the plane. One captain said he walked into the cockpit, and standing in there was flight engineer Don Repo, and Don promptly told the captain about a specific malfunction in one of the engines before Don vanished in front of this captain. Now, this captain was horrified at what he had just seen, but he did actually go down and have that engine looked at, and sure enough, the malfunction that Don Repo said it had. Then finally, in 1974, all of these strange events just came to an abrupt stop. Now, no one knows exactly why, but in 1974, Eastern Airlines, despite telling the world they didn't believe any of the reports of these strange happenings on their planes, despite that year, they went into every single one of their L-1011 jets, and they removed any parts that had been placed on them from the crashed Flight 401. Despite the fact none of those parts were faulty. They were removing perfectly good parts, and they never gave a reason. And after they did that, all the sightings just stopped. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please invite the Amazon Music follow button to a Ouija board session, and once everyone's fingers are on the pointer, ask if anyone likes the Amazon Music follow button, and then subtly move the pointer over no. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. Consider donating to our charity. It's called the MrBallen Foundation, and it provides support to victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to mrballen.foundation and click Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.